Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Julian Herrera. I'm a maintenance technician for telecommunications infrastructure for a company that installs signal repeaters throughout the country, even in places where theoretically no one lives. I've worked in absurdly remote locations, jungles in Louisiana, snow-capped peaks in Montana, even on an oil platform off the coast of Texas. But nothing prepared me for what I experienced in the Mojave Desert in California. It was late May, right during the hottest days of the year. The sun gave no respite, and everything smelled of dry earth and the hot metal of tools under the truck's hood. My boss assigned me work on one of the company's most remote antennas, an old repeater in the middle of the desert, about 30 miles south of Barstow, on a flatland known as Devil's Playground. There's nothing out there, he told me before giving me the assignment. No houses, no marked roads, but the tower is sending erratic data and we need to check it. It's one of those that bounces radio signals and broadband for federal routes. It's been trouble-free for years, until now. He gave me a portable radio with open frequency, a basic satellite unit, and a report code I had to send every 6 hours to confirm everything was fine. There was no cell signal for miles around. I would be going alone for 3 days. The tower rose from a dry, rocky point, isolated from the world. It was a rusted steel mast about 100 feet high, with a control shed to one side, made of white sheet metal and topped with a solar panel. There was no shade, no trees, no animals, just earth, wind, and the sound of heat accumulating in the air. I set up my camp a few meters away, a camping tent, a cooler with enough water, a generator, dehydrated food, and a tarp to cover the truck from the sun. The first thing I did was check the equipment. It was more or less in order. Most likely it was a temperature sensor failure. Nothing serious, routine work. The first night, however, something strange occurred. I was inside the shed checking the voltage regulator when the portable radio, which I had left charging, began emitting a strange interference white noise, like static from an old television, but accompanied by something else. A murmur. At first, I thought it was some stray signal caught by the antenna. It's rare, but not impossible. But the murmur began taking shape. It was a soft voice, barely audible, a woman's voice. "Do you copy? Do you copy? There's someone there I can't see." I stopped dead, closed the regulator cover, and picked up the radio. "Who's speaking here? This is Maintenance Station 511 at Devil's Playground Tower. Identify yourself. Over." Silence, then the voice returned. "They're not alone, they're everywhere, the wind. Listen." I turned off the radio. I turned it back on. Only static. I thought it was a transmission accidentally picked up, a voice filtered from some nearby frequency. Radio frequency can play tricks: heat, atmospheric ionization, everything can reflect distant waves. But that night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked the radio more carefully. The frequency it had activated on wasn't one used by the company or by civilian services. It was 101.730 megahertz, a frequency that, according to my notes, was marked as unassigned in that sector. I scanned it several times. Nothing. I finished my technical tasks, sent the first report via satellite, and tried not to think about it. But just as evening fell and the sun began to tinge the desert stones orange, the radio sounded again, this time louder. "Julian, are you there? It's dark here. I don't know how much time has passed." That voice was no longer a stranger's, it was familiar. "Who's speaking?" I asked with my heart pounding in my throat. "It's me, Maria." That name made me drop the radio. It was the name of my sister who had disappeared 3 years ago while traveling with her partner on a coastal route between San Diego and San Francisco. No one knew more about her. Her car was found abandoned on a stretch of desert without signs of violence or tracks. The last we knew was that she had made an interrupted emergency call saying they had seen strange lights on the road. I picked up the radio with trembling hands. "Maria, where are you? It's cold. There's no light. I thought you weren't going to find me." Her voice was breaking as if it had interference, but it was undoubtedly her tone, her words, her way of speaking. "How are you transmitting? From where?" I insisted. "I don't know. I don't see the sun. I only hear the buzzing, the voices." The transmission cut off. I was left with the device pressed to my ear. Not another sound, just the desert. Night fell on me like a black sheet. I turned on my headlamp, checked the shed, even climbed part of the tower to see if anything strange was happening with the antenna. Nothing out of the ordinary, just that immense and absolute silence that the desert keeps for those who dare to stay. That early morning I didn't sleep. I sat by the radio scanning frequencies, trying to find the same signal. For hours, nothing, until 3:21 in the morning when the voice returned, distorted, more urgent. "Don't open the door, don't answer, just listen." I stood up, looked around. There was no open door. What door? There was no response, but at that moment I heard something that chilled my blood. Footsteps on gravel, right outside the shed. Not wind, not animals, human steps. I turned off the flashlight. I remained in absolute silence. The steps stopped, moved, then approached again. There was no one in sight, but the antenna had motion sensors. I checked the empty logs. The next morning I dozed for a few minutes until dawn. The radio was mute. I recorded the frequency in the device's memory, packed my things, and completed the tower diagnosis as if nothing had happened. But in the final technical report, I marked something I had never done before. Persistent interference, possible non-technical origin. External evaluation suggested. Back in Barstow, I delivered the report, but didn't mention the voices. They couldn't understand it. No one would believe me. That night in my motel room, I sat down to listen to the recording I had made with the portable radio connected to a digital recorder. The file was damaged, just noise, nothing recognizable except for 1 second. Minute 17:42. Right there, you can clearly hear a female voice in a low tone saying, "Julian, they're not voices. They're echoes. Not everyone who disappears leaves. Don't forget me." I still have that recording. Sometimes I play it to remind myself it wasn't a dream. I don't know if it was her. I don't know if something in the desert takes over dead frequencies. But since that day, every time I hear a radio crackle in the middle of silence, I stay still, waiting for that voice in case it returns. The desert has a way of playing with sound that I've never experienced anywhere else. During the day, it swallows noise, your voice, footsteps, even machinery seems muffled. But at night, it amplifies everything. The the slightest sound carries for miles. And sometimes you hear things that couldn't possibly be there. I've been back to that area twice since then, always for work, never alone. Each time, I've made sure to stay away from that particular frequency. But I can't help myself from scanning it just to see if anything comes through. So far, nothing. But I know she's out there, somewhere in the static between stations, waiting for someone to find the right frequency. The company never followed up on my recommendation for external evaluation. They fixed the temperature sensor remotely and marked the case closed. But I know better. Some signals aren't meant to be explained by technical manuals. Some frequencies carry more than just data. The desert keeps its secrets, and maybe that's how it should be. But sometimes, when I'm working on a remote tower and the wind starts to pick up, I still hear her voice carried on the air, calling my name, asking me not to forget. And I never will. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, with the knowledge that somewhere out there, in the vast emptiness of the desert, my sister might still be trying to reach me. It's a comfort and a torment all at once. But it's also a reminder that not everything can be explained, that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The recording sits in my desk drawer, a digital ghost of a voice that shouldn't exist. Every now and then, I play it back, listening for new details, hoping for some clue that might lead me to her. But the desert has claimed her, and perhaps that's where she belongs now, in the space between frequencies, in the silence between words, in the echo of a voice that refuses to be forgotten. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. What I'm about to tell you isn't a story I made up to entertain or frighten. It's something that happened to my family, something that still makes me check locks twice and avoid certain sections of antique stores. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like I'm being watched. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon in Phoenix, and my husband David and I had decided to take our 5-year-old daughter Emma on one of our wandering adventures through the city. We'd been exploring different neighborhoods, stopping at coffee shops and bookstores, when we stumbled upon a small antique shop tucked between a pizza place and a dry cleaner. The shop was called Desert Memories, and the window display was filled with the usual assortment of vintage items. Old cameras, turquoise jewelry, weathered leather boots, and Native American pottery. The owner, a thin man with silver hair and deeply tanned skin, looked up from polishing a brass lamp as we entered. "Feel free to browse," he said with a warm smile. "Everything's got a story, and most of it's priced to sell." The shop was larger inside than it appeared from the street, with narrow aisles winding between tall shelves packed with decades of accumulated treasures. Emma was fascinated by a collection of old dolls near the front, while David gravitated toward a display of vintage tools. I was examining a set of turquoise earrings when something caught my eye on a high shelf behind the counter. It was a figurine, about 12 inches tall, carved from what looked like dark stone or clay. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, with intricate details that seemed to shift and change as I looked at it from different angles. "That's an interesting piece," I said to the shopkeeper, pointing to the figurine. He followed my gaze and nodded. "Ah, that one. found it in a storage unit auction last month. The previous owner was an art collector, had pieces from all over the world. That particular figure is supposed to be Mesoamerican, though I can't say for certain what culture or time period. I asked him to bring it down so I could examine it more closely. As he placed it on the counter, I felt a strange pull toward it, as if it were calling to me somehow. The figure depicted a tall, imposing humanoid form with elaborate headdress and what appeared to be jaguar skin clothing. One leg was smooth and dark, while the other seemed to be made of a different material that reflected light in an almost mirror-like way. "The detail work is incredible," I murmured, running my fingers along the carved surface. "It feels old, really old." The collector's note said it came from an estate sale in Mexico City, the shopkeeper continued. Family had owned it for generations, but the younger generation wasn't interested in keeping it. Their loss, I suppose. Emma had wandered over and was staring at the figurine with wide eyes. "Mom, that man looks scary," she said quietly. "It's not a man, sweetheart," I said. "It's just a statue, probably of an ancient god or ruler." But Emma kept staring at it with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "He's very tall," she said matter-of-factly, "and he watches people." David laughed. "Emma's got quite an imagination," he said to the shopkeeper. "She thinks all statues are alive." The price was $60, which seemed reasonable for such a detailed piece. I'd been wanting to add some interesting artifacts to our home decor, and this figurine would look perfect on the built-in shelves in our living room. We bought it along with the turquoise earrings and headed home. I placed the figurine on a prominent shelf where it could be admired from multiple angles. In the afternoon sunlight streaming through our windows, it looked majestic and mysterious. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The figurine was an interesting conversation piece when friends came over, and I enjoyed the way it added an air of ancient mystery to our modern home. But gradually, I began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere of our house. The living room, which had always been bright and welcoming, started to feel heavy and oppressive, especially in the late afternoon when the shadows grew long. The temperature in that room seemed to drop several degrees, even when the rest of the house was warm. I found myself avoiding the living room during certain times of day, though I couldn't explain why. There was just something about the way the light fell on the figurine that made me uncomfortable, as if it were more than just a carved object. Emma's behavior changed too. She became unusually attached to the figurine, talking to it when she thought no one was listening. I'd find her sitting on the floor in front of the shelf, having one-sided conversations with what she called the tall man. "What do you talk to him about?" I asked her one evening, trying to keep my voice light and casual. "He tells me about the jungle," Emma said, not looking away from the figurine. "He says he used to live in a big temple with lots of stairs, and people would bring him presents." "What kind of presents?" "Flowers and food and—" She paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. "He says people used to dance for him, but now he's lonely because no one dances anymore." I felt a chill run down my spine. Emma had never shown any particular interest in ancient cultures or temples. Where was this coming from? Things escalated when we started taking the figurine with us on family outings. Emma would insist on bringing it along, clutching it protectively in the backseat. At first, I thought it was sweet, like a child's attachment to a favorite toy. But every time we traveled with the figurine, something went wrong with our car. The engine would stutter and die at red lights. The dashboard lights would flicker erratically. And once the horn started honking on its own while we were parked at a grocery store. David, who was mechanically inclined, couldn't find anything wrong with the car systems. We had 3 minor accidents in the span of 2 weeks, all of them inexplicable. A sudden swerve to avoid a pothole that wasn't there. Brakes that seemed to engage on their own. A steering wheel that jerked to the left for no apparent reason. Each time we walked away shaken but unharmed. And each time Emma would clutch the figurine tighter and whisper, "He kept us safe." But the most terrifying experiences began happening at night. I started suffering from episodes of sleep paralysis, something I'd never experienced before in my life. The first time it happened, I woke up around 3 in the morning, completely unable to move. My eyes were open, and I could see everything in the bedroom clearly, but my body felt like it was made of lead. Standing at the foot of our bed was a figure that made my blood turn to ice. It was impossibly tall, easily 7 feet, with an elaborate feathered headdress that brushed against our ceiling. Its body was covered in what looked like jaguar skin, the spots seeming to shift and move in the darkness. One of its legs was normal, but the other was like polished obsidian, reflecting everything around it with perfect clarity. The most horrifying part was its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where features should have been, there was only a swirling void that seemed to pull at my consciousness, as if it were trying to draw my thoughts into itself. I tried to scream, to call for David, but no sound would come. The entity just stood there, radiating a presence so ancient and powerful that I felt like an insect in comparison. When I finally regained control of my body, I sat up gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. David was still sleeping peacefully beside me, and there was no sign of the figure. I convinced myself it had been a nightmare, a product of stress and too much caffeine. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Each time, the entity seemed to get closer, and each time, I could feel its attention focused on me with an intensity that was almost physical. The third episode was the worst. I woke up paralyzed as usual, but this time the figure was standing directly beside the bed, so close I could have reached out and touched it if I'd been able to move. The obsidian leg was reflecting our entire bedroom, showing me angles and perspectives that shouldn't have been possible. But what terrified me most was that I could hear it speaking, not with words, but directly into my mind. The language was completely foreign, harsh and guttural, with sounds that human vocal cords were never meant to make. As it spoke, I felt a pressure building in my skull, as if my brain were being compressed. The meaning of its words became clear despite the alien language. It was angry at being confined to such a small vessel, frustrated by its inability to exert its full power. It spoke of temples and sacrifices, of a time when it was worshipped by thousands, when the sound of drums and the scent of copal incense filled the air. When I finally broke free from the paralysis, I found bruises covering my arms and legs, large purple marks that looked like handprints. My head was pounding, and I felt like I'd been beaten with a baseball bat. David was horrified when he saw the bruises. "What happened to you?" he demanded, his voice tight with concern. I tried to explain about the sleep paralysis, the figure, the feeling of being physically assaulted by something invisible. He listened with growing alarm, especially when I showed him the marks that clearly looked like someone had gripped me with incredible force. "We need to get you to a doctor," he said immediately. "This isn't normal. Sleep paralysis doesn't cause physical injuries." But I knew no doctor would be able to help me. The problem wasn't medical, it was the figurine. The final straw came when David had his own encounter with the entity. He was coming home late from work, and as he pulled into our driveway, he happened to glance up at our roof. There, silhouetted against the night sky, was the unmistakable figure of the entity from my dreams. It was crouched on the edge of our roof like a gargoyle, its massive form balanced impossibly on the narrow gutters. The feathered headdress was spread wide, and even from the distance of the driveway, David could see the obsidian leg glinting in the streetlight. He sat in the car for several minutes, afraid to get out, afraid to take his eyes off the thing on our roof. When he finally worked up the courage to look again, it was gone. That night we had a family meeting. David described what he'd seen, and Emma, instead of being frightened, seemed excited. "He's getting stronger," she said, with the matter-of-fact tone that only 5-year-olds can manage. "He told me he's almost ready to come back for real." "Come back from where?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "From the place where they made him sleep. He says people used to bring him what he needed, but then they stopped, and he got very tired. But now he's waking up again." David and I exchanged glances. We both knew what we had to do. The next morning, while Emma was at preschool, we wrapped the figurine in old towels and drove to the city dump. We didn't donate it, didn't try to sell it, didn't even give it away. We buried it deep in the landfill, covering it with bags of regular garbage and construction debris. As we drove away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The air in the car felt lighter, cleaner, as if we'd just escaped from a room full of smoke. That night I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. No paralysis, no ancient presence, no mysterious bruises. Emma seemed disappointed when she noticed the figurine was gone, but she didn't ask about it, as if she somehow understood that its time in our home was over. Our house returned to normal gradually. The living room became warm and welcoming again. The car stopped having mysterious mechanical problems, and Emma went back to playing with her regular toys. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel like I'm being watched. And sometimes, when I'm driving past construction sites or areas where new developments are being built, I wonder if someone might uncover that figurine, might be drawn to its dark beauty just as I was. I've learned that some objects are more than just artifacts. They're doorways, conduits for forces that were never meant to exist in our modern world. And sometimes, the price of bringing ancient powers into our lives is far higher than we could ever imagine. If you ever find yourself drawn to something old and mysterious, something that seems to pulse with its own energy, maybe ask yourself whether you're really buying a piece of history, or whether you're inviting something into your home that should have stayed buried in the past. My name is Morris Delgado. I'm 34 years old and a professional photographer. I've worked for nature magazines, travel agencies, and even government tourism campaigns. But for the past couple of years, I've specialized in astrophotography. I dedicate myself to capturing night skies, stars, nebulae, light trails. Things most people don't notice because they're too busy looking at their phones. One of my personal goals was to photograph the sky from the Big Bend National Park in Texas. It's one of the darkest places in the entire United States, free from light pollution, with ideal altitude and skies that, when clear, allow you to see the Milky Way like a luminous wound crossing the firmament. I had planned the trip for months. I prepared with maps, permits, weather reports, lunar phases, survival equipment, solar batteries, lightweight tents, dehydrated food, everything. I know the basics of navigation and first aid. I wouldn't venture out to camp alone if I didn't feel safe. I left on a Friday in September after driving 6 hours from Austin. I drove up to Terlingua, a small ghost town on the edge of the desert, where I left my car with a local I'd been recommended. From there, carrying my equipment on my back, I took a trail that climbs to the Lost Mine Trail Overlook, one of the highest points in the area. The plan was to camp 3 nights, enough time to take long exposure captures, experiment with filters, create time lapses, and survey the sky at different hours. The first 24 hours were perfect. Dry climate, brilliant stars, silence broken only by crickets and the occasional distant coyote. I felt fortunate. But when reviewing the first images on my laptop, I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. In one of the captures, a 30-second exposure facing north next to the treetops, a dark figure appeared, barely perceptible. It could have been a shadow, a movement effect from the branches, but it had a very defined, human, motionless form. I enlarged it. It had no face or details, just a silhouette. I thought maybe it had been a lens error, an insect, or even myself accidentally crossing the frame. But that night, I didn't move from the tripod. I knew it well because I had programmed the remote trigger and moved a few meters away to have coffee while the sensor did its work. I decided not to think too much about it. The next morning, I set up the equipment at another angle, pointing east over a clearing that faced a small canyon. I left it in automatic mode for 3 hours. When the sun went down, I returned to review the shots. And there it was again, the same figure, only now it was closer to the edge of the frame. There was no way someone could move without me hearing it. The forest in that part creaks, sings, complains. Every step on dry leaves is like a gunshot, but I heard nothing. Nothing. I checked the location. There were no tracks, just the usual animals, insects, broken branches, some old raccoon droppings. I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but I rationalized everything. Maybe it was a distant branch that, with the low light, formed that silhouette. Maybe my mind was starting to play tricks on me. I slept poorly that second night. I dreamed someone was walking around my tent, breathing heavily on the other side of the nylon. I woke up drenched in sweat, flashlight in hand, but saw no one. The third night, I decided to do something different. I placed 2 cameras, one pointing at the sky as always, and another, a small mirrorless with a wide-angle lens, pointing toward the campsite to make a security time lapse. I didn't want scares. I wanted to confirm that what I had seen was a coincidence, a trick of light. I slept with the computer on and an external hard drive capturing the video. At dawn, the first thing I did was review the material. The camera pointing at the sky had a beautiful sequence of the Orion constellation crossing the sky, but the one pointing at the campsite was something else. At 1:47 in the morning, the camera registers a shadow crossing in front of the tent, not walking, but gliding. It moves slowly, without precise form. but there's something in its outline, something that resembles a human body. You can't see the face or clothes, just presence. A blur darker than the night. Seconds later, in the same video, 2 points of light can be seen in the distance, like eyes. They shine for barely a couple of seconds, then disappear. The camera, being low sensitivity, doesn't capture more. I paused the video, rewound it, watched it again and again. Nothing changes. It's there. I don't know how to describe what I felt. It wasn't fear in the classic sense, like when someone mugs you or shouts at you. It was a sensation of having been watched for hours without knowing it, of having shared the place with something. I don't like that word, but it's the only one I have. I packed everything quickly. I didn't wait for the 4th night. I went down the trail trembling, carrying my backpack as if it were filled with stones. I reached Terlingua around noon, exhausted, but without looking back. The man who was watching my car saw me pale and didn't ask questions. He gave me a bottle of water and told me something that left me cold. "You saw the shadow, didn't you?" I didn't respond, just nodded. He lowered his voice, looked toward the hills, and said, "It happens here, but only those who come alone see it. Don't tell anyone. Just don't come back to camp alone, young man. The desert keeps things." Back home, I spent weeks reviewing the material. I tried to send it to colleagues, but something inside me said they wouldn't understand. It's not a clear figure or compelling evidence. It's a sequence of images that leaves something inside you rather than something outside. I published some photos of the sky on my social media, the clean ones. The others, the ones with the figure, I kept them. I look at them sometimes. I try to edit the brightness, improve the contrast, look for more details. And every time I do it, the figure seems to be in a different position. I don't know if it's my eyes or if it knows I'm watching it. Since then, I've gone to photograph skies in other places, Joshua Tree, Death Valley, the Rockies, but I've never returned to Big Bend, although something tells me that in part I never left there. Because there are nights when, while editing at home with the lights off, I feel someone looking over my shoulder from behind the screen, and there's no star capable of illuminating that presence. The desert has a way of getting under your skin that's different from any other landscape. It's not just the vastness or the silence. It's the feeling that you're being observed by something ancient, something that was there long before humans ever set foot in that wilderness. I've talked to other photographers who have worked in Big Bend, and while most have only stories of spectacular sunsets and pristine night skies, a few have mentioned similar experiences. Always the same pattern: solo photographers, multi-day shoots, and something in the periphery of their vision that shouldn't be there. There's a local legend about a lost prospector who died in those hills back in the 1800s, but I don't put much stock in ghost stories. What I experienced felt more immediate, more present than some 19th century spirit. It felt like something that belonged to the desert itself, something that had always been there, watching, waiting. The footage I captured that night remains on my hard drive, filed away in a folder I rarely open. But sometimes, when I'm working on other projects, I find myself scrolling through those files, looking for details I might have missed. The figure never becomes clearer, but it never becomes less unsettling either. I've considered going back, maybe with a team, maybe with better equipment. But every time I start to plan it, something stops me. Maybe it's fear, or maybe it's respect. Some things are meant to remain mysterious, and some encounters are meant to happen only once. The desert keeps its secrets, and perhaps that's how it should be. But I know now that when you venture into the wilderness alone, you're never really alone. Something is always watching, always waiting, always there just beyond the edge of your vision. And sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, it decides to let you see it. That Saturday morning started like any other. Mom and I had driven to the farmer's market in downtown Austin, weaving through the usual crowds of families picking out fresh produce and artisanal goods. The Texas sun was already getting intense by 10 in the morning, and I was ready to head home when something caught my eye. There in the window of a small vintage boutique tucked between a coffee shop and a used bookstore hung the most elegant black dress I'd ever seen. It was simple, but stunning, with delicate lace trim around the neckline and a classic silhouette that seemed to call out to me from behind the glass. The shop was cramped and dimly lit, filled with the musty scent of old fabric and forgotten memories. Vintage jewelry sparkled in dusty display cases, and racks of clothing from decades past lined the narrow aisles. The elderly woman behind the counter looked up from her crossword puzzle as I approached. "That dress has been waiting for the right person," she said with a knowing smile, her voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "Came in with an estate sale lot last week. Beautiful piece, isn't it?" I ran my fingers along the fabric. It was silk, or something close to it, and felt impossibly soft despite its obvious age. The price tag read $30, which seemed too good to be true for something so well made. "It's gorgeous," I breathed, holding it up against myself in front of an ornate mirror. The reflection showed how perfectly it would fit, how the black would complement my dark hair. "Previous owner must have taken real good care of it," the shopkeeper continued, folding it carefully into tissue paper. "Looks like it was barely worn. Some folks say clothes hold memories, you know. The love, the special occasions, all of it." I laughed off her comment, but something in her tone made me pause. Still, $30 for a dress that probably cost 10 times that new was too good to pass up. I handed over the cash and walked out with my treasure. At home, I immediately threw it in the washing machine with my gentlest detergent. I wanted to make sure it was completely clean before wearing it out. After it dried, I hung it carefully in my closet next to my other good dresses, and didn't think much more about it. That first night, I woke up suddenly around 2 in the morning. It wasn't a sound that pulled me from sleep, but a scent. Strong and floral, like expensive perfume, but with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of funeral flowers. The fragrance filled my entire bedroom, as if someone had just walked through, leaving a cloud of their signature scent behind. I sat up in bed, confused. I don't wear perfume that strong, and my mom certainly doesn't use anything that fancy. The smell was elegant, but overwhelming. The kind of fragrance that spoke of another era, when women dressed up for every occasion and wouldn't dream of leaving the house without being perfectly put together. I patted around my room, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, maybe something from a neighbor's apartment drifting through the vents. I opened the window for fresh air and went back to sleep. The second night was different. The same perfume returned, but this time it was so strong it made my eyes water. I got up, following the scent trail like a bloodhound, and it led me directly to my closet. When I opened the door, the fragrance hit me like a wall. It was coming from the black dress. I pulled it out and held it to my nose. The silk radiated that same intoxicating scent, as if it had been soaked in perfume just moments before. But that was impossible. I had washed it thoroughly, and it hadn't smelled like anything when I hung it up. I checked the pockets, the seams, anywhere perfume might have been trapped, but found nothing. By morning, the scent had vanished completely, leaving me questioning my own senses. Things got stranger when Mom started having the dreams. She mentioned it casually over breakfast on Tuesday, stirring her coffee with a distracted look. "Sweetie, I had the oddest dream last night," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. There was a woman in our living room just sitting in the armchair by the window. She was wearing that black dress you bought, and she was just waiting, like she was expecting someone. My spoon clinked against my cereal bowl. What did she look like? Young, maybe in her 20s. Dark hair in an old-fashioned style, like they wore in the 40s or 50s. She had this sad expression, like she was mourning something. Mom shook her head. Probably just my brain processing all those antique store smells from Saturday. But it wasn't just one dream. Night after night, Mom would wake up with stories about the same woman. Sometimes she was in the living room, sometimes standing by the kitchen window, always wearing my black dress, always with that same melancholy expression. I decided to wear the dress out, partly to prove to myself that it was just a normal piece of clothing. My boyfriend Jake picked me up for dinner at a nice restaurant downtown, and he complimented how beautiful I looked. The dress fit perfectly, moved with me like it was made for my body, and I felt elegant and confident all evening. When we got home, I hung it back in the closet and tried not to think about the dreams or the phantom perfume. But the worst night was still to come. It was a Thursday, and I'd been up late binge-watching a series on Netflix. Around midnight, I decided to grab a snack from the kitchen. Our apartment is set up so you have to go down a short hallway past the living room to reach the kitchen. I was halfway down the hall when I saw her. At first, I thought it was Mom, maybe sleepwalking or getting water. But as I got closer, I realized this person was too small, too delicate to be my mother. She was standing perfectly still at the entrance to the kitchen, her back to me, wearing the black dress I'd bought just 2 weeks ago. "Mom," I called out softly, but there was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. The hallway light was dim, casting long shadows, but I could see her clearly enough to know this wasn't right. Her hair was styled in victory rolls, perfectly set like she'd just left a 1940s beauty salon. Her posture was unnaturally straight, formal in a way that seemed from another time. I took a step closer, my heart beginning to race. "Excuse me," that's when she turned around. Her face was pale as moonlight, with dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises. Her lips were painted deep red, but the color seemed wrong, too dark, almost black in the dim light. She looked directly at me with eyes that held a sadness so profound it made my chest ache. She didn't say a word, just stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Then, moving with fluid grace, she walked straight toward the kitchen door. I watched in horror as she passed through the solid wood like it was made of mist, disappearing completely. I ran to my room, slammed the door, and threw open my closet. The black dress hung there innocently, exactly where I'd left it. I grabbed it, feeling for any trace of warmth or unusual energy, but it was just fabric and thread. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bed with the lights on, staring at the dress until dawn broke through my windows. The next morning, I told Mom everything through tears and trembling hands. She listened quietly, her face growing paler with each detail. "Oh, honey," she whispered when I finished. "That's her. That's the woman from my dreams. Every detail matches perfectly." We sat in silence for a long moment, both understanding what we were dealing with. This wasn't just a vintage dress. It was a connection to someone who couldn't or wouldn't let go. "We need to get rid of it," Mom said firmly. "Today." We didn't donate it or try to sell it. We wrapped it in a garbage bag and put it out with the trash that very afternoon. I stood at the window and watched the garbage truck take it away, hoping that would be the end of it. The perfume never returned. Mom's dreams stopped immediately. Our home felt light and peaceful again, like a weight had been lifted from the very air. But sometimes, when I pass vintage clothing stores, I catch a whiff of that same floral scent. And I remember the woman in the black dress who just couldn't say goodbye to the life she'd left behind. If you ever find something beautiful at a price that seems too good to be true, maybe ask yourself why someone was so eager to let it go. Some bargains come with a cost that no amount of money can measure. My name is James, and I've always had a fascination with the unknown. Since childhood, I've loved mystery stories, especially those whispered along the border, where the line between Mexico and the United States blurs and legends interweave with reality. One of those stories, the one that disturbed me most, was about the old ruined house that stood near the Rio Grande, right at the edge of the border. It was said to have been an old refuge for smugglers from the era of Prohibition, a dark place wrapped in tragedies and marked by inexplicable events. No one dared to approach after people who entered the house began to disappear. Nobody talked about it, but everyone knew what I was referring to. When I was 20 years old, after hearing so many stories, I decided to go investigate on my own. I didn't believe in ghosts or superstitions. My logical mind told me that everything had a reasonable explanation, but still, the idea of entering that place intrigued me. I decided it would be my next adventure. That morning, I headed to the nearest town where I gathered some information. The elderly looked at me with suspicion when I asked about the house, and their answers were vague, almost as if they feared to name it aloud. Son, an older man who had worked his whole life on the nearby ranch, told me, "That house was built more than 100 years ago. At first, it was a rest house for travelers crossing the border. But then something happened. It was closed, and no one really knows what occurred there." "What happened?" I asked with curiosity on the verge of impatience. The man looked at me fixedly and then whispered, "They say several men died there, some from hunger, others from strange diseases, and some in ways that no one dares to explain. No one who has entered that house has come out the same. Many things are said, but none of them are good." Despite the warning, something inside me urged me to continue. I took a backpack with the basics: water, a flashlight, some food, and my camera. I rented a bicycle in town since the house was somewhat remote. I headed toward the route that led to the river. During the journey, the sun was setting, and a cool evening breeze began to envelop the landscape. Finally, after an hour of cycling, I arrived. The house, or what remained of it, rose in the distance like a shadow of what was once a prosperous place. It was almost hidden among the trees, with broken windows and walls covered in moss. The wind seemed to whisper among the branches, and the sound of crickets filled the air, though the place was empty, solitary. A strange coldness ran down my spine, but I attributed it to the falling evening. As I approached, I saw that the main door was ajar, as if inviting me to enter. I didn't hesitate and pushed the door. A dry creak resonated, and I entered. The first thing I noticed was the smell. The air inside was heavy, humid, with a mixture of rotting wood and earth. The walls were crumbling in some parts, and dust covered the floor, which made me walk cautiously. The broken and abandoned furniture made it clear that no one had set foot in that place for a long time. I toured the rooms, exploring, taking photos, and noting in my notebook everything I saw. I was determined to get something interesting from that place, even if it was just to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. I headed to the upper floor, where the stairs creaked under my weight. When I reached the top, the view was more somber. The walls were covered with old wallpaper that was peeling and hanging as if it wanted to tell me something, but I couldn't understand what. Suddenly, a dull noise came from somewhere on the lower floor, like a thud. I froze. It couldn't be someone else. I was alone. I thought it might have been an animal, or perhaps the old structures were simply creaking from the wind. But something didn't leave me at peace. The air inside the house was heavy, and a strange sensation began to take hold of me, as if something or someone was watching me. I decided to go down and check, but when I reached the vestibule, I saw something that made me stop dead. In one of the corners, there was an old rocking chair, and it was moving by itself with a low noise, as if it were being pushed by an invisible hand. The face of an old, wrinkled, and pale man appeared in my mind like a fleeting vision. I felt my legs turn to jelly, but I forced myself to move forward. "It's just the wind," I said in a low voice. "It's just the wind." However, my mind began to play tricks on me. The air inside the house seemed colder, and the silence was so absolute that it made me feel as if I were trapped in a place where time didn't exist. I looked around and saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, as if something were sliding quickly between the walls. I decided it was time to leave. However, when I tried to open the door to go out, the handle broke in my hands. I tried to force it, but it was stuck. The feeling of panic began to take hold of me. I began to pound on the door, to scream for help, although I knew no one would hear me. The strange noises increased, and now they were more evident. Creaking on the floor, something dragging through the hallway. A freezing cold ran down my spine, and my breathing quickened. I felt as if the house itself was trapping me, as if the walls were slowly closing around me. The sound of the rocking chair stopped suddenly. A low, incomprehensible whisper began to fill the air. I turned toward the living room, but I saw no one. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to stay calm, but my body wasn't responding. My head began to hurt, and all I wanted was to get out of there. However, as I moved away from the door, a figure appeared in front of me so suddenly that I froze. It was a diffuse shadow, barely visible in the penumbra, but the contours of its face were unmistakable. A face of anguish, with empty eyes staring fixedly. The air filled with a rotten aroma, and the echo of distant laughter began to surround me. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt the figure approaching until I was just a few centimeters away from it. At that moment, everything went dark. I woke up lying on the floor with the flashlight turned off beside me. The place was silent, and the shadow had disappeared. But the house was no longer the same. Everything looked more deteriorated, older, as if I had been transported back in time. The broken furniture was now covered with a thick layer of dust, and the air no longer smelled of humidity, but of something denser, more suffocating. My mind was confused. What had happened? Had it been a dream, a delirium? Or had something really been there watching me? I didn't know. But something inside me told me I should leave immediately. I managed to open the door with a blow and ran toward the bicycle, barely conscious of what I was doing. I didn't approach the house again. I don't even know how I got out of there. The only thing I know is that the sensation of being watched hasn't left me since that day. Something in that place marked me, and although I try to convince myself that it was all a product of my mind, I can't stop hearing those whispers. In my dreams, I see that figure approaching, and when I open my eyes, I feel that I'm not alone. The house is still there, at the edge of the border, waiting for someone else to dare to enter. And I, for my part, prefer not to know what else happens within its ruins. Welcome. Before I begin this account, I'd like to know where you're listening from and what time of day you prefer to hear these stories. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. Without further delay, let me begin. My name is Julian Vance. I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in fauna research. For over a decade, I've worked with jaguars, ocelots, coatis, deer, and all manner of creatures that roam the deepest parts of the Mexican rainforests. Most of my work has been in Chiapas and the Tuxtlas region. But last April, I was presented with an opportunity I'd always dreamed of. The chance to document nocturnal species behavior in the Calakmul Biosphere Reserve in Campeche. The project was part of an agreement with a European university. They were interested in monitoring animal movement patterns in areas rarely traversed by humans. They proposed I work alone for 2 weeks in a sector far removed from the main camps. I accepted without hesitation. I've always preferred working alone. They sent me with all necessary equipment: infrared trail cameras, nocturnal sound recorders, GPS units, a small camping tent, provisions for 10 days, and a shortwave radio. There was no cell coverage at that location. The specific area where I set up camp was about 4 hours on foot from the last accessible point by truck, following paths opened by old chicle harvesters. It was an untouched paradise. Colossal ceiba trees, bromeliads hanging like green hair from branches, the calls of howler monkeys waking me each morning as if mocking the modern world. There in the heart of the jungle, you feel part of something greater. On the first day, I installed 6 trail cameras around a dry stream bed. I marked their locations with GPS and placed small baits to attract animals. Then I returned to my tent and began recording environmental behavior. Fresh tracks, abandoned nests, nocturnal beetles, insect patterns. Everything normal, everything as I expected, until the 4th night. It was that early morning when I first saw something strange. Around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by sounds I didn't recognize. They weren't jaguars, nor monkeys, nor owls. It was something more rhythmic, like footsteps, firm steps on dry leaves. I left the tent with my flashlight, looking around in silence, holding my breath. The sound stopped. Several minutes passed. Then I saw a reflection, not animal eyes, which usually reflect light like two small dots, but a kind of mist that moved barely perceptibly between the trees, like a thin, vertical figure that disappeared instantly. I stood there for almost half an hour, waiting for the sound to return, but nothing happened. I convinced myself it might have been some animal I didn't know. Here everything is denser, Wilder. I went back to sleep. The next morning I went to check the cameras. 3 captured nothing. Another had a couple of coatis. The 5th showed a jaguar crossing at midnight, but it was the 6th camera where everything changed. The first 2 photos were normal and ocelot and a possum, but the 3rd made me blink several times. I didn't know what I was seeing. It was a humanoid silhouette, tall, elongated, but deformed, standing about 5 meters from the camera between 2 trees. It had no visible clothing, but its skin appeared dark, covered with something like mud or bark. The arms were too long. Instead of a face, it had something blurred, as if it were moving when captured. The photo was black and white. Infrared doesn't capture color, but I still felt a chill. I checked the timestamp. 2:07 in the morning. Exactly the time I had heard the footsteps. I returned to camp feeling watched. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. A lost hunter, a vagrant, a poorly captured animal, whatever it was. But that night I didn't sleep, and the next was worse. At 2:15 in the morning, the sound repeated, clearer this time. Steps, one after another, slow, heavy, as if someone were deliberately walking in circles around my tent. I didn't dare go out. I just turned off the flashlight, grabbed my machete, and sat inside the tent holding my breath. The steps lasted maybe 15 minutes, then moved away. The most terrifying thing was that I never heard branches breaking or bushes moving, only dry leaves. At dawn, I went out to check the perimeter. I expected to find tracks, something, but there was nothing, not even my own footprints from the day before. The ground was clean. I returned to the cameras. Only 3 had content. In one of them, the figure appeared again, closer this time. Now looking directly at the camera. There was no face, only a kind of indentation where a face should have been, as if someone had carved a face in wood and then half erased it. I spent hours comparing proportions. They didn't match any animal or common human. There was no logic to it. I recorded the SD card content on my laptop, copied the images to a memory stick, and deleted the original from the camera. I made a decision. I had to cut the expedition short. At 6 in the evening, I tried to communicate by radio with base camp. Only static. I tried every hour, nothing. I decided to leave at dawn. I wasn't going to spend another night there. That last night was different. There were no footsteps, no sounds, only absolute, unnatural silence, as if the entire jungle had gone quiet. No insects, no wind, no monkeys, only the hum of my portable lantern. At 3 in the morning, without warning, the tent moved. A hand, a claw, something pressed against the canvas from outside as if feeling around slowly. It didn't scratch or hit, just slid across the fabric. I remained paralyzed. After that, silence again. At 5, I packed everything I could in my backpack and left. I walked without rest for the 4 hours to the exit point. The guide was waiting there with the truck. He said I looked pale, sick. I didn't respond, said nothing, just asked him to take me to the nearest town with signal. 2 days later, I delivered the material to the project coordinator. I gave him everything: animal records, sound recordings, maps, except the memory stick with the photos of the figure. I kept that one. I didn't want to be part of something I didn't understand. But that night, already at home, I received an email from the coordinator. It was a brief note. Interesting pattern in camera 6. Do you have more images of that figure? I had never told him which camera had captured it. Since then, I haven't returned to the field. I continue working in the lab, analyzing data, writing reports. I've stayed away from the large reserves, but that memory stick remains stored in a metal box hidden among my things. Sometimes, when I see it, I feel I made the right decision. Other times, I think I made a mistake keeping it, because for the past 3 weeks, in the early morning hours, I've been hearing footsteps on dry leaves, and I no longer live in the jungle. I've thought many times about throwing away that USB drive, breaking it, burying it, even setting it on fire, but I don't. Something inside me, I don't know if it's professional instinct, simple stubbornness, or a curiosity that's costing me my peace of mind, prevents me from getting rid of it. I know that memory stick contains evidence of something that doesn't fit any rational explanation. Something that doesn't match any of the species I've studied my entire life. And at the same time, I know that having it here at home is a way of attracting something that shouldn't be near. But don't believe me at first. I wouldn't have believed it either if it weren't for the fact that everything I'm telling you has happened. If I had an ounce of imagination for drama, I'd tell you that each night I feel it getting closer, that I've seen its silhouette in my window. But no, this is real, and what makes it worse is precisely that it's possible. After the coordinator's email, whose name I don't want to mention here, I didn't respond. I left it on read. The next day he called me. I didn't answer. Then I received another email, this time more direct. Julian, we understand if you don't want to collaborate anymore, but at least share the complete images. There are patterns that could confirm what others have recorded in the Mosquitia in Honduras. You're not the first, just the first to capture it so close. I was frozen. I'm not the first. Others have seen it. I didn't know how to process that. I thought about responding, asking for more information, but I stopped myself. There was something in the email's tone, something cold, technical, that made me pull back, as if this was no longer a discovery, but a protocol. That night, for the first time, I heard footsteps outside my house. I don't have a yard. I live in a ground-floor apartment in a 3-story building in Salina Cruz. There's a corridor that leads to the utility room. It's dirt and stones, poorly lit. There, right between 2 and 3 in the morning, I heard dry, slow steps, like those in the jungle, not shoes or bare feet, but steps on loose earth, as if someone were walking while slightly dragging their heels. I got up, walked to the window, and opened the curtain slightly. Nothing, but the sound continued, coming from the right side next to the water heater room. I didn't dare go out. I stood with my hand on the curtain and waited. The steps stopped. The next day I checked the corridor. The dirt was disturbed, as if someone had walked in circles. I said nothing. What was I going to tell my neighbors? That I was being followed by a faceless creature from Calakmul. Days passed. I tried to distract myself. I returned to work reviewing field recordings, editing nocturnal audio for a colleague who was monitoring owl populations, but I couldn't concentrate. So I did something I shouldn't have done. I opened the USB drive. I had reviewed it before, but this time I did it with a magnifying glass. I observed every frame, every shadow, every pixel. I took the exact coordinates where the image was captured and cross-referenced them with topographic maps and ancient pre-Hispanic trade routes. I found nothing conclusive, but something caught my attention. There was a pattern. The figure always appeared at the same time, between 2:06 and 2:14 in the morning, always in the same quadrant of the frame, never moving more than a meter between shots. It seemed to be watching the camera as if it knew it was there. It didn't move like an animal or a common human. It didn't approach with curiosity or flee from the infrared light. It just appeared standing for a moment, then disappeared. In one of the last photos, number 47 in the series, something changed. The figure wasn't standing, it was crouched right in front of the camera, as if it were smelling it. That was the last image the camera captured. The next night, the card filled up. The battery had died on the third day. That same week, someone visited me. It was Friday, around 10 in the morning. I heard knocking at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, there was a man in a light suit with dark glasses and an ID hanging from his neck that I couldn't read well. He claimed to be from an international conservation foundation. "Are you Julian Vance?" he asked without preamble. "Yes, who's asking?" "I was informed you were recently in Calakmul. We want to talk to you about some recorded material you captured. It's part of a larger investigation." I didn't let him in. I told him I was busy, that I didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't insist, just nodded with a strange smile, as if he already knew I was lying. "Well, if you change your mind, here's my card." It had no logo, just a phone number. I blocked it instantly. Now I sleep poorly. The early morning hours are the worst. I don't always hear the footsteps, but when I do, I know it's not my imagination. It can't be. One night I even woke up with the curtain open. I'm sure I had closed it before sleeping. I no longer have the memory stick at home. I left it hidden in an envelope inside a metal box buried in my grandfather's land in the Chiapas Highlands. Nobody knows. Nobody will find it unless I decide otherwise, because that's the truth. I know they'll come for it. I don't know who, I don't know why, but they will come. And I know that if they catch me with it, they won't ask me anything. They'll just take it and maybe something more. The dangerous decision I made wasn't going alone to the jungle, nor keeping the photos. The dangerous decision was documenting something that shouldn't be documented, something that, if it exists, changes the way we understand this world. Not from fantasy, not from the mystical, but from the biological, from the real. And that's what's most frightening. Because if something like that can walk among us, so close, so hidden, so adapted to not being seen, then the problem isn't whether it's watching us. The problem is that it learned long ago to imitate us, and it's waiting for us to open the door. My name is Martin Alvarez, and I'm a regular hiker. I've always loved hiking, being in contact with nature, enjoying the calm and solitude that the mountains offer. I'm from Denver, Colorado, but I don't like the hustle and bustle much, so I try to escape whenever I can to the natural areas. My favorite route, until recently, was a lost canyon in the mountains of the Colorado Rockies. It's a place that for me had always been a refuge of peace. The fresh air, the enormous rocks, the tall trees, and the frogs croaking at night. Everything seemed so simple, so harmless. All of that changed one night. It was a few weeks ago on an excursion I decided to take alone. I wanted to find something more than the common trails, something deeper, more remote. I was used to walking on known routes, but that time I wanted to venture further inside, toward the less explored corners of the canyon. It wasn't the first time I had walked in that place, but it was the first time I ventured so late with darkness already fallen. I started walking at noon, confident in my abilities and experience. The first stretch was relatively simple. The rocks formed small natural passages, and the sound of my breathing was the only thing that broke the absolute silence. However, something in the environment began to feel strange. The temperature started to plummet as the sun set, and the sky turned a somber gray. My steps, which before were firm, now seemed to echo more than usual, as if the earth itself were absorbing each of my movements. As the sun said goodbye, and the darkness of night took over everything, I realized I had moved much further than I thought. The map I carried was incomplete, and I could no longer recognize the rock formations around me. I decided to continue, trusting I could return before it was too late. But the night in the canyon has a way of taking over the space, transforming everything into a tangle of shadows that move at their own rhythm. The worst part was when the cold became unbearable and the first drops of rain began to fall. I didn't worry much at first. I thought it was just a little passing rain. But when I entered a narrowing of the canyon, a small passage between the rocks where the vegetation tightened, I realized I had made a mistake. The fog began to envelop everything. The air became dense, and my senses began to play tricks on me. My flashlight didn't illuminate beyond a few meters, and the rain had already become a torrent that made my vision difficult. It was then that I realized I didn't know where I was. I had lost all sense of direction. I couldn't remember where I had come from or where I should go. I began to walk frantically, looking for a high point, a rock that would allow me to see the terrain, but everything around me was identical. The rain wouldn't stop, and the wind became a constant howl that cut my face. And then the noises began. At first, I thought they were animals. After all, I was in a canyon full of wildlife. I could hear nocturnal birds and leaves that creaked under the weight of some mammal. But then the noises changed. I began to hear footsteps, as if someone were walking behind me. They weren't the steps of an animal, no. They were too heavy, too human. Suddenly, the environment that had been tranquil transformed into something tense, something that lurked in the shadows. I stopped dead, and the first time I heard them, the steps seemed distant. But then, as I advanced, I heard them closer. My breathing accelerated, and cold sweat began to wet my back. I turned around several times trying to see something in the darkness, but I only saw the rocks and trees that swayed under the wind. Nothing more. I didn't want to accept what my mind was suggesting to me, that I wasn't alone. I thought about making noise, about screaming, about running, but I realized that could attract even more attention. I decided to keep walking, trying not to make noise, but my steps, which before were light, now seemed to resonate in the void. Each creak of my boots on the ground felt like a scream in the middle of the night. Whatever happened, I had to get out of there. As I advanced, the feeling of being watched only intensified. The noises continued, steps dragging, creaking of branches, something moving among the rocks. Then, a clear and distinct sound broke the silence. It was like a whisper, but it was so close I thought someone was talking directly in my ear. I turned quickly, illuminating the darkness with the flashlight. Nothing. I began to walk faster. The ground, now wet from the rain, was slippery, and the sound of my steps was amplified in the fog. Suddenly, a howl tore through the air, a howl that wasn't from a wolf or any other animal I knew. It was something deeper, more grave, as if it came from the very heart of the earth. The howl repeated, and my skin crawled. My flashlight flickered, and the sensation of danger became unbearable. Something or someone was following my movements. My legs began to fail. My mind couldn't take it anymore. I began to run without direction, disoriented, my heart beating so fast it seemed it was going to explode. In my desperation, I tripped and fell on the slippery rocks. The flashlight went out completely. The darkness was total. The fog no longer moved, and the wind ceased suddenly, leaving me in an absolute silence, heavy. At that moment, something moved around me. The shadows were no longer just shadows. I saw something or someone moving among the rocks. I couldn't see well, but a tall and thin human figure appeared in my field of vision, barely illuminated by the faint light of the extinguished flashlight. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. My legs were paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, the being or whatever it was emitted a sound. It wasn't a voice or a whisper. It was a guttural sound, as if something were breathing deeply, and then it approached even more, moving slowly. My senses sharpened to the maximum, and at that instant I knew I had to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. Then the figure vanished in the darkness with the same speed it had appeared, as if it had never been there. Fear made me react. I got up with effort, searching for my flashlight in the darkness. My body trembled from head to toe, but I couldn't stay there. I took the flashlight, and with trembling hands I turned it on again. The noises continued, but now they knew different. They were softer, like human whispers, and they came from everywhere around me. I felt something was watching me from the rocks, but I couldn't see anything. I shot out without thinking, without direction. I don't know how long I spent running, but when I finally saw a sign of the trail, my mind couldn't understand how I had gotten so far. I left the canyon at dawn, exhausted, with the rain already stopping and the air clearing. That night, while I walked back to the nearest town, I knew it with certainty. I wasn't alone. Someone or something had been watching me among the rocks, following me, stalking me. And that presence never completely faded from my mind. I never returned to the canyon. And if I ever decide to return, I'll do it with more caution, with the doubt of whether those echoes of the night are just animals or something more human, something that lurks waiting in the shadows. The days following my experience in the canyon were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Although I tried to convince myself that it had been a mix of exhaustion, stress, and solitude, something inside me told me that what I lived that night wasn't a product of my mind. When I returned to the nearby town, I felt relieved to see the lights of the place. But at the same time, a void began to invade me. I felt something had been left behind, something that shouldn't remain there. I didn't talk to anyone about what had happened. I feared they would take me for crazy. In the town, people saw me as the same Martin as always, the hiker who had returned from an excursion a little late. But the truth is my head wouldn't stop spinning. The noises, the figure among the rocks, the whispers, everything kept circling in my thoughts. One morning I couldn't take it anymore. I gathered courage and returned to the starting point, to the canyon. But this time I didn't go alone. I asked an old friend, Hugo, to accompany me. Hugo had always been a good hiking companion, someone with whom I could share my routes without problems. He was somewhat skeptical about my fear stories, but he told me that maybe it could be some kind of animal or even an echo of my mind due to stress. But I knew something had driven me to return. I felt I needed answers. The weather was different, the sky was clear, and the air was fresh, as if the place had been washed of the fog and fear it had left in me. We walked calmly for a couple of hours, enjoying the landscape as if nothing had happened. The canyon seemed to have returned to normality, but something bothered me. My memory of the places was no longer so clear. Although I had been there on several occasions, the trails seemed more confusing than I remembered. My friend, oblivious to my discomfort, was ahead of me chatting as if nothing was wrong. When we reached the area where I had heard the first noises last time, I felt strange. I didn't know if it was fear clouding me, but that place no longer seemed the same. The rocks, which at first had seemed imposing and beautiful to me, now looked as if they were arranged in a strange way, in a way that didn't fit with the natural landscape. Hugo, seeing that I was standing there observing the rocks, called me from further ahead. "Hey Martin, don't stand there," he said in a mocking voice. "Come on, we have a good stretch to cover." He snapped me out of my trance and I followed him. I didn't look at the place of strange formation again, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was watching me from there. As we advanced, we reached a narrowing of the canyon, a passage that, although known, seemed different to me. The sunlight was already fading, and the environment began to become more somber, denser. It was there that, without warning, we heard a loud crack, as if something big were moving among the rocks. Hugo stopped dead and turned toward me with a somewhat confused expression. "Did you hear that?" he asked. My breathing accelerated. That same sensation, that discomfort began to surface again. I looked around, but I saw nothing, only the shadows that were beginning to lengthen and the moss-covered rocks. The truth is, at that moment I didn't know if what I felt was fear or a deep intuition that something wasn't right. "It must be some animal," I replied, trying to sound convincing. However, Hugo wasn't so sure. He took cautious steps, observing with more attention than normal. After a few minutes of walking in silence, the same sensation returned to emerge. Steps sounded in the distance on the rocks, as if someone or something were following us. But they weren't common steps. They were heavy, dragged, almost as if the earth itself were suffering the weight of what moved over it. At first I thought it was another animal, maybe a cougar or some other predator. But doubt began to grow. "Martin," Hugo whispered to me with a worried tone, "are you sure this is normal? Animals usually move on the slopes of canyons, but those steps, I don't know. They don't sound like those of an animal." His voice broke a little, and I could notice he was beginning to feel uncomfortable. My pulse accelerated, but I tried to stay calm. "It's probably the echo of the wind, nothing more," I told him, although I didn't believe it myself. Suddenly, Hugo moved forward, apparently determined to approach the area where the noises came from. My instinct told me we shouldn't continue forward, but before I could say anything, Hugo stopped abruptly. At that moment, I saw how his face changed completely. The calm he had shown up to that point disappeared, and in its place appeared a palpable fear. Hugo was looking at something among the rocks, something I couldn't see. "What's wrong, Hugo?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned toward me, pale as a sheet. "Do you hear it?" he said with a trembling voice. "They're not animals there, they're voices." At that moment, the wind ceased completely, and the only thing I could hear was what Hugo mentioned: voices, but not the voices of nearby people. They were whispers, as if someone were conversing in the distance among the rocks, or worse yet, as if someone were watching us and murmuring right behind us. I tried to listen more carefully, but the voices were unmistakable. They didn't come from animals, they didn't come from the wind, they were too human. My body tensed. Hugo looked at me now with a mixture of incredulity and fear. "Are we going to leave?" he asked, unable to hide his terror. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed his arm and began to walk in the opposite direction, without even looking back. The voices faded as we moved away, but they still remained on the edge of my consciousness like a distant echo that followed me. Until finally, when we left the canyon, the daylight enveloped us, and the calm seemed to return, at least momentarily. When we reached the nearby village, neither of us said anything during the journey. We were exhausted and scared, and although we tried to talk about what had happened, the words got stuck in our throats. Hugo, normally so rational, couldn't explain what he had heard. I, for my part, knew that something more was happening there. It wasn't just fear. There was something in that canyon, something human, something ancient that shouldn't be disturbed. The next day I returned to that same point, but not out of curiosity, but out of the need to find some explanation. I gathered courage and went up to the place where the voices had been heard. I spent hours searching, observing every corner, every rock formation, but I found nothing. There were no traces of human beings, no footprints, no signs that anyone was there. However, the voices never stopped accompanying me in my mind. I never returned to the canyon. Since then, fear hasn't completely left. And although the people of the town continue their daily lives, I know that something strange and human inhabits that canyon. Something that lurks in the penumbra, waiting. My name is Hugo, and I've been a hiking enthusiast for as long as I can remember. For years, I've traveled through different corners of the Pacific Northwest, and there's nothing I like more than getting lost among forests, mountains, and solitary valleys. A couple of months ago, a group of friends and I decided to take a hike through the Cascade Mountains in Washington State. We wanted to disconnect from everything, get away from routine, and enjoy nature in its purest state. We had heard about the shelters in the region, remote places where hikers take refuge when weather becomes unpredictable or when night falls in the mountains. So without thinking much about it, we organized the trip. The group consisted of 5 people: Rick, my lifelong friend; Claudia, a woman who had recently started hiking but had become an excellent hiker; Louis, a man of few words but with great leadership capacity; Laura, Rick's girlfriend, always enthusiastic and with a love for adventure; and me, the one who always takes the camera to document every step, every landscape. We traveled through the mountains during the day without major incidents. The beauty of the place was indescribable: the density of the trees, the murmur of streams, the singing of birds. Everything seemed perfect, as if we were in a painting that came to life. As the sun faded and night began to fall, we reached the shelter where we would spend the night. The shelter was at over 8,000 feet above sea level, located on a small plateau that opened between the pines and mountains. It was a simple construction of wood and stone, with a metal roof that creaked with the wind. It seemed isolated from the world, and the view from there was spectacular. However, there was something unsettling about the way the place was built. The entrance didn't have a real door, just a thick fabric curtain that seemed to move without reason when entering, as if someone were touching it from inside, although we were alone. As we settled inside, the wind began to blow forcefully. The shelter creaked every time a gust hit it, and the wooden walls emitted strange whispers, as if the house itself were alive. It wasn't something new for us. We were accustomed to the sound of wind in mountains, but something wasn't right. Claudia was the first to notice something strange. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice somewhat trembling. We looked at her, expecting her to point out the wind or some common noise, but her eyes were fixed on a corner of the shelter, in the corner farthest from the fireplace. "Do you hear something?" Louis asked, approaching. "It's as if—" Claudia fell silent, frowning as if someone were breathing there. We laughed, thinking it was just the sound of wind seeping through the cracks. But after a few minutes, we all began to notice something strange. The curtain covering the entrance moved strangely, as if something or someone were pushing it from outside. The wind wasn't strong enough to justify it, and at that moment, a shiver ran down my spine. It could be an animal, maybe a deer or some other mountain creature attracted by the shelter's light. We tried to ignore it, lit the fireplace, and began preparing some food. But the atmosphere remained unsettling. The sound of wind seemed to become a kind of lament, a whisper that became increasingly clear. The fireplace crackled, but even the warmth of the flames couldn't dispel the feeling of discomfort surrounding us. As night fell, the sounds from outside intensified. The wind lashed the shelter walls forcefully, and the windows creaked with each blow. We gathered around the fire, trying to distract ourselves with stories and laughter, but something wouldn't let us rest. At one point, when it was completely dark, we heard something else, something that couldn't be explained so easily. A muffled, repeated tapping came from the wall, facing the forest. "Did you hear that?" Rick asked, looking at everyone. We looked at each other. It couldn't be the wind. The sound was too rhythmic, almost as if someone were tapping the wall with their fingers with strange precision. But there was no one outside or near the shelter. We decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights, we went outside, facing the storm of wind and snow that was already beginning to fall more heavily. At first, the darkness was total, only interrupted by our flashlights. We walked around the shelter's perimeter but found nothing. The snow covered everything, and the wind had erased all traces. We thought maybe it was just effects from the storm. We returned to the shelter, but the discomfort persisted. Upon entering, something changed in the air. The walls continued creaking, but this time the sound seemed closer, more personal. We approached the corner where Claudia had noticed the strange presence before. When one of us touched the wall, a slight sound emerged from within, as if something were behind it. Louis tried to knock on it, but the wall sounded hollow, too hollow for a simple wooden structure. At that moment, the entrance curtain moved with more force, as if someone were pressing it from outside. And then we heard it. It wasn't the wind or an animal. They were voices, very weak, almost inaudible, but clear. It wasn't English, but they sounded like words dragged by the wind, something ancient, an incomprehensible whisper that chilled our blood. We remained silent, paralyzed. What's happening?" Claudia said, visibly frightened. A few seconds later, the sound ceased, but the atmosphere was no longer the same. Each of us stood looking at the others, not knowing if it was fear or paranoia, but there was something in the air we couldn't ignore. We decided we wouldn't sleep there. The idea of spending the night in that shelter with that strange presence became unbearable. But before leaving, something else happened. The door, which before was just a fabric curtain, slammed shut as if something invisible had pushed it. The air became icy, and the voices, now clearer, began to resonate inside the shelter. They were no longer just whispers. We could distinguish fragments of phrases. "Leave them. There's no path," they repeated. Louis, determined to leave, pushed the curtain forcefully. When he did, the outside seemed even more somber than before. The wind lashed with such force that we almost fell over, but the sensation of being watched was unbearable. We felt something was watching us from within the darkness, and we couldn't bear it anymore. We ran out without looking back, losing ourselves in the night and snow. As soon as we reached a clearing, we stopped. We looked at the shelter in the distance. Through the windows, a light remained on, but it was no longer the same. It was a fixed light, without movement. And for a second, we could see something in the window, something that shouldn't be there. We never returned to that shelter. No one else in the group wanted to talk about the matter, and neither did I, although over time, I've realized that maybe we weren't as safe as we believed. The voices in the Cascade Mountains weren't the wind or the creaking of walls. There was something else, something we still don't understand and probably never will. The mountains of Washington State hold secrets that go back long before the first settlers arrived. The indigenous peoples of the region, the Yakama, the Muckleshoot, the Snoqualmie, all have stories about places in the high country where spirits dwell, where the boundary between worlds grows thin. That shelter we found wasn't on any official trail map. I've searched extensively since our return, contacted the Forest Service, checked with hiking organizations. No one has any record of a shelter in that location. It's as if the place exists in the spaces between, in the gaps where reality grows soft and other things can slip through. Sometimes I wonder if we actually left that night, or if we're still there, still sitting around that fire, still listening to those voices that speak in languages older than human memory. The sensation of being watched hasn't left me completely. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake in the night with the feeling that someone is standing just outside my vision, just beyond the edge of sleep. The others have moved on, or at least they pretend to have. Rick and Laura broke up not long after we returned. He said she became too clingy, too afraid of being alone. Claudia moved to California, claimed she needed a change of scenery. Louis still hikes, but never in groups anymore, always alone. He says he prefers the solitude, but I think he's afraid of what might follow us back. The mountains keep their secrets, and perhaps that's how it should be. But I know now that some shelters aren't meant to provide protection from the storm. They're meant to protect the storm from us. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, when the boundaries grow thin, those protections fail, and we catch a glimpse of what's been waiting in the darkness all along. The voices still whisper in the wind, speaking words in languages that predate human understanding. And somewhere in the high country, that shelter still stands, still welcomes the occasional lost hiker who stumbles across its threshold, still guards whatever secrets it was built to contain. I carry the memory with me like a weight, a reminder that there are places in this world where the rules we take for granted simply don't apply. places where safety can be an illusion, where shelter can be a trap, and where the act of seeking refuge can lead to something far more permanent than you ever intended. My name is Louis, and if I'm writing this, it's because what I experienced that night on the coast of Monterey changed something in me. Today, remembering those moments, I can't help but wonder if what happened was real, or if my mind played one of those bad tricks that sometimes make one feel lost. However, no matter what people think, what I know is what I saw and what I felt. Everything happened on a clear night, one of those nights when the sky seems to be closer than normal, and the full moon illuminates everything around it with a cold and constant light. I was a common young man with a relatively quiet life. I spent most of my days working at a music store in downtown Monterey, and when I had time, I used to enjoy the tranquility that the coast offered. That night, after a long day, I decided to take a walk along the beach. At that moment, I didn't know that decision would change my life forever. It was around 10 o'clock at night when I left my house and headed toward the coast. The air was fresh, and the salty breeze coming from the sea made everything feel sharper, as if every sound and every movement had greater clarity. It wasn't the first time I had walked around there, but that night something felt different. The moonlight softly reflected on the waves that broke calmly on the shore, and the tranquility of the sea felt almost unbreakable. From time to time, the sound of seagulls broke the silence, and the lights of boats on the horizon mixed with the stars. I began to walk on the wet sand without a fixed destination, simply enjoying the atmosphere and the calm. I loved the feeling of the sand under my feet, as if it connected me with something bigger, something I didn't understand. While I walked, I thought about how fortunate I was to live in such a beautiful place. Monterey is known for its coast and its landscapes, and those solitary walks helped me disconnect from the daily hustle and bustle. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, and the beach seemed even emptier than normal. I didn't see anyone either in the water or on the shore. However, as I ventured further into the path that followed the coast, I began to notice something strange. The footprints in the sand weren't normal. At first I thought they were just marks left by some animal, maybe a dog or some other marine being that walked along the shore. But as I advanced, I saw that the footprints didn't have a natural pattern. They were deep, larger than normal, and extended for miles in the direction I was going. I decided to follow them out of curiosity. There was no wind that could have altered the sand, and the footprints seemed fresh, as if someone or something had left them there minutes before my arrival. I couldn't help but feel a strange discomfort, as if something in the air had changed. A chill ran down my back, but I tried to downplay it. It must be someone else walking around here, I thought, convinced that what I was seeing was just a coincidence. The footprints stretched along the path, twisting at some points, as if they were left by someone who didn't walk in a straight line. As I got closer to them, I began to notice something even stranger. The footprints weren't just in the sand, but also on the rocks that were near the shore, as if something or someone had walked on the hard surfaces without any problem. It was as if the footprints floated in the air and landed on everything they touched. That disturbed me even more. I looked to the sides, trying to find some logical explanation. There were no signs of any human being in the distance, and the footprints didn't match those of any animal I knew. While I walked toward the next group of rocks, I heard a dull sound, as if something heavy were sliding through the sand behind me. I stopped dead, but I saw nothing. The wind, which at first was gentle, began to blow harder, moving the waves and making the breeze jump toward my face, but there were no signs of life nearby. Then I felt a presence. It was as if someone were watching me, but I couldn't see anyone. I felt vulnerable, as if the sea itself were whispering something through its waves. I took a couple of steps back. I looked around, and when I turned I saw that the footprints kept appearing right behind me, clearer now, as if someone were following me, imitating my steps. My breathing accelerated. I looked toward the sea, toward the horizon, and I saw a shadow move in the water, but only for a moment before disappearing. I couldn't say if it was a boat or something else, but my instinct told me I shouldn't stay there much longer. However, something prevented me from leaving, something that kept me intrigued, as if I couldn't resist following the footprints that now were clearly visible around me. I decided to continue walking. Although each step I took filled me with growing anxiety, something pushed me to continue. The footprints became stranger with time. Now they seemed to mix with mine, as if something were dragging them from one side to another, leaving them and erasing them at the same instant. Suddenly, the sound of something walking on the sand reached my ears, something heavy and dragged, as if someone were walking clumsily. My body tensed, but when I turned around, all I saw was the empty expanse of the beach. I gritted my teeth and quickened my pace, but when I took a turn, I saw a thin figure at the end of the beach, near some large rocks. It was a man, or at least that's what it seemed like, dressed in worn clothes, his face covered by a hood that didn't let me see his features. The first thing I thought was that it could be someone else walking in the area, but something didn't fit. The figure didn't move, and the silence around him was so heavy it seemed crushing. I decided to approach, feeling my body tense more with each step. When I was close enough, the figure raised its head, and then I saw it. It had no face. There was a deep darkness where there should have been eyes and mouth. A total void, a black emptiness like the sea itself in the darkness. I felt fear run through my entire being, but something forced me to look at the ground. The footprints were now completely different. They were around the figure, but they didn't follow the pattern of someone who walked naturally. They were irregular, twisted, as if something that didn't belong to this world had been dragging itself. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. The footprints no longer just followed me. There was something else, something that had been following me the entire way. And that figure, that faceless presence, was just the beginning of something much bigger. The figure began to move toward me, but it didn't walk. I couldn't move. I felt the air become dense, my mind cloud over, and everything around me darken. In the end, all I could do was run. Run as fast as I could toward the city, without looking back, with the feeling that this presence was catching up to me. When I finally got home, dawn was near, and the sun was beginning to dimly illuminate the horizon. The beach, the sea, everything had returned to calm as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. I never walked on that Monterey coast again. And although I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, or that fatigue played a bad trick on me, the truth is that something inside me tells me that what I experienced that night was something real, something that's waiting. I never walked on that Monterey coast again, but the memory of that night continues to haunt me. Sometimes, When I pass near the beach, I can't help but feel something watching me from afar, as if the sea itself were waiting. I've tried to rationalize it, convince myself that it was just fear playing with my mind, or that maybe fatigue made me see things that weren't there. But I can't. Something inside me knows that what I lived was real. After that night, the days seemed to pass more slowly. I returned to work, to the music store, and although everything seemed the same, there was a strange sensation in the air, as if something I couldn't identify was stalking me in every corner. I talked to my friends, to acquaintances, but somehow I felt disconnected from all of them. No one could understand what I had experienced, and just talking about it made me feel even more isolated. At first, I tried to forget what had happened. I thought it had been a mix of loneliness, the coastal atmosphere, and a bit of paranoia. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice small details that made me question even more what I had lived. For example, the noises. Some nights when I slept, I would wake up with the sensation that someone was walking through my house, as if someone were passing through the hallway, right outside my room. Sometimes it was a soft sound, almost imperceptible, as if something heavy were dragging across the floor. Other times, the creaking of the wooden floors, as if someone were taking very slow steps. The worst part was that when I opened the door to look at the darkness of the hallway, there was nothing more than silence and the uncomfortable feeling of being watched. These small experiences continued for weeks, and although I tried to convince myself they were just my imagination, fear kept growing. I couldn't shake the feeling that the faceless figure on the beach wasn't just a simple product of my mind. Something told me that figure had seen something in me, something it shouldn't have seen. One afternoon, almost 2 months after what happened, I returned to the coast. I hadn't planned it, but there was something inside me that couldn't let it go. I needed to understand. I needed to know if what I had experienced that night was real, or if I had simply let myself be carried away by fear. I returned to the same place where I had walked that night, to the same stretch of beach where I had seen the strange footprints. The tide was low, and the place seemed almost identical to what I remembered, except that instead of the stillness of the night, there was light, sun, people walking and enjoying the landscape. Everything seemed normal, everything except the weight I carried in my chest, as if the place were waiting for me to remember it. I walked along the sand, but now, in broad daylight, the footprints I had seen didn't appear. Everything was clean as if they had never existed, but still, there was something in the air that made me uncomfortable, something I couldn't explain. At first, I tried to calm myself. I thought maybe it had been a bad decision to return, but as I walked further, something broke in the air, as if a layer of calm had been torn and something else, something ancient, had begun to awaken. Suddenly, I found myself in front of some large rocks, right at the end of the path I had traveled the last time. I didn't know why, but I felt I should approach, and I did. As I got closer to the rocks, something on the ground caught my attention. They weren't footprints, but they were strange marks, as if something very heavy had been dragged through the sand. The marks extended for a small stretch, and although they didn't have a clear pattern, something told me I had seen them before. Suddenly I heard a noise, a dull and strange one, as if someone were hitting the rocks hard. I looked around looking for the source of the sound, but I saw no one. The beach was calm as always, but in my chest I felt a knot, a growing anxiety that made me wonder if what I had experienced that night hadn't ended, but was waiting for me to face it again. Suddenly, a shadow slipped through the corner of my vision. It wasn't big, but it moved strangely, as if it floated rather than walked. I turned quickly, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw what was in front of me. It was a figure. It wasn't the same one from the previous night, but its presence was equally disturbing. A man, or at least something that seemed like a man, had the same hunched posture, the same hood that hid his face, and that same stillness as if he were part of the rocks themselves, of the earth itself. I couldn't move, I just stared at him. At that moment, his figure began to dissolve in the breeze, as if the darkness of the night were wrapping him again. My breathing accelerated, and with an effort I tried to take a step back, but something inside me told me I couldn't simply flee. I couldn't keep ignoring what I had seen. Then, as if he had been waiting for me, the figure raised his hand, pointing toward the sea. In that gesture there was nothing threatening, but something told me I shouldn't keep watching. It was as if his hand were indicating that there was something in the sea, something I shouldn't see. My instinct forced me to look at the horizon, toward the water, and at that moment I saw something that floated on the surface of the sea. It wasn't a boat or a buoy or anything that had a logical explanation. It was a shadow, an indistinct form that moved slowly toward the coast. I couldn't see what it was, but I felt it was approaching not the beach, but me. The next thing I knew was that I was running. I ran without thinking, without looking back, just knowing I couldn't stay there one more second. The sound of my steps echoed in my head, and the sea, that vast expanse of water I had always considered tranquil, now seemed like a threat, as if the entire ocean were willing to devour me. I reached my car without looking back, and when I finally started it and drove away from the coast, I felt something had changed in me. It wasn't just fear that was chasing me, but the certainty that what I saw, what I experienced, wasn't just an illusion of the mind. Something was there, something that had been waiting, watching from the shadows, and that now knew it wouldn't leave so easily. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than a bad dream, a nightmare that had come to life. But every time I passed near the coast, I couldn't help but feel that something ancient and strange, was still there, waiting for me to return. I never will. My name is Marcus Calderon. I'm 38 years old, a civil engineer, graduate of Georgia Tech, and for over a decade I've specialized in public works supervision, mainly highway infrastructure. I've worked in all types of zones, deserts, coasts, forests, but never, not even on my worst days in the Louisiana bayous or the Appalachian Mountains, had I experienced what happened to me on a stretch of road in the mountains of West Virginia, between Beckley and Summersville. It was August of 2019. A company subcontracted by the Department of Transportation hired me as an external supervisor for a project that had been delayed for months. The resurfacing and widening of a rural road that was going to become a secondary route to connect various communities in the coal mining region. From the first day, the atmosphere seemed tense. The base camp was in a narrow valley, flanked by bare hills, and the climate was suffocating even at 8 in the morning. The workers were from different places. There were masons from Charleston, machinery operators from Huntington, and some young helpers from small mountain towns who had come up to the construction site looking for work. Equipment was scarce, materials arrived late, and crews rotated every week. The company, a small contractor that had never worked in mountainous terrain, was doing everything haphazardly. My job was to document progress, review cuts, sign logbooks. But I quickly realized the real challenge was maintaining people's morale. There were murmurs among the workers that something felt strange in the area, that the nights were restless, that sounds of chains or footsteps could be heard in the ravines. I didn't believe in superstitions, so I always told them to rest well and not stay up late drinking beer. Everything changed on September 22nd. That day, one of the workers disappeared. His name was Adam Reeves. He was 26 years old, quiet but hardworking. The night before, he had stayed with two other companions to guard an improvised tool and cement warehouse half a mile from the camp. They did it in shifts because a generator and 2 diesel containers had already been stolen weeks before. When dawn broke, the other 2 returned to camp, but Adam didn't. They said he went into the woods to relieve himself and never came back. We thought he had fallen asleep somewhere or gone down to the river to wash, but by 10 in the morning, we were all worried. We organized a search, walked up and down the slope. There was no trace, no footprints, no clothing remains, nothing, just silence. One of the masons, an old man named Lazarus, said something that stuck with me. The earth swallowed this one up. Here, when the mountain chooses someone, it never lets them go. That same afternoon, I called the responsible engineer from the company, a young guy named Mark Vega. I told him what had happened, and the first thing he did was ask me not to file any official report yet. "What do you mean, don't file anything?" "We have a missing worker," I shouted over the radio. "Calm down, Calderon. This has happened before. Sometimes they leave without notice, go down to see family, or head into the hills with the pot smokers. You know how it is. Don't make noise. Tomorrow he'll show up." That smelled fishy to me. It wasn't the first time someone had disappeared. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed in my trailer with the radio on. I heard strange noises, like stones rolling down the slope, branches breaking. At some point, I thought I saw a light flickering in the distance in an area where there were no poles or houses. Cell signal was dead. It was as if we were trapped in another world. The next day, Mark arrived by helicopter. Not just him, he was accompanied by a lawyer from the construction company, a suited guy who looked like he hadn't stepped on dirt in his life. They arrived with 2 trucks full of boxes, supposedly with topography equipment, but I never saw them use a single piece. They gathered us supervisors and asked us to sign a document confirming that Adam had voluntarily absented himself from the work site and that there was no evidence of forced disappearance or workplace accident. I flatly refused. "What are you hiding?" I asked. "If you're afraid it was something criminal, you should report it." "It's not a legal matter, it's an internal matter," the lawyer told me in a tone that didn't admit discussion. "You're hired as a work supervisor, not as an investigator." That's when I knew Adam's disappearance wasn't an isolated case. That afternoon, I approached Lazarus, the old mason. I offered him a cigarette and asked if he knew anything. He stayed quiet for a while. Then he told me, "I worked on another project near Morgantown in 2007, also highway work, also in the mountains. A boy disappeared there the same way, at night. They said they found him at the bottom of a ravine, but it wasn't true. They never found anything. And then one of those same lawyers came, just like the one who came today. and they made us sign things. He showed me something he wore hanging around his neck, a rusty St. Michael medal with an inscription that said protection on the roads. "It's not for accidents," he said. "It's for what walks among the trees." The following days were hell. Some workers started leaving, saying they felt afraid. Others talked about hearing Adam calling from the woods with a distorted voice. One night, one of the dump truck drivers locked himself in his cab crying, saying he had seen someone with a melted face walking among the trees. I didn't believe any of that until I saw the notebook. It was in Adam's backpack, which no one had reviewed properly. I found it while we were taking inventory of his equipment to return to the company. Most of it was scribbles, accounts, drawings, unfinished phrases. But at the end, there was a page with a kind of map, a pencil line drawn from the camp to a clearing to the south, and a notation that said, "The cave of those who don't return." I didn't know what to do. I mentioned it to another engineer on the site, a younger guy from Virginia Beach. He asked me not to get involved further, that the mountains have their rules and you can't come to change them. But I couldn't just stand by with my arms crossed. 2 days later at dawn, I went out alone. I carried a flashlight, hiking boots, and the notebook in my pocket. I walked following the line from the map. It took me about an hour and a half to reach the clearing. It was right where the drawing indicated. There, hidden among the bushes, I found an opening in the rock, a narrow cave with the floor covered in dry leaves. I entered. The air smelled of humidity and urine. I advanced carefully. After a few meters, the flashlight illuminated what looked like a wall of abandoned tools. Picks, shovels, even a rusty wheelbarrow. Further in, I found something worse. Thrown clothing, a reflective vest, boots, a backpack like Adam's, and something else. A destroyed phone with a cracked screen. I turned the flashlight toward the back and swear I saw something moving, as if someone or something was sliding across the floor. I didn't wait any longer. I ran out. I returned to camp before dawn. I didn't say a word. The next day, the construction company announced that the project was temporarily suspended for budgetary reasons. In less than a week, everything was dismantled: trucks, containers, mobile offices. When I went down to Charleston, they called me to sign a confidentiality agreement. They offered me a bonus for cooperation during the contingency. I signed it not out of cowardice, but strategy. I knew that if I said something at that moment, no one would believe me. What I saw or what was down there wasn't part of any plan. It was older, deeper, and it wasn't engineers' business. Today, I no longer work in the field. I supervise projects from offices in Washington, D.C., but I still dream about that cave. And sometimes when I walk through some construction site under review and see the mountains in the distance, I feel something watching me, something that still keeps secrets under the earth where maps don't reach. And sometimes I wonder, how many more have disappeared in projects like that under the silence of the mountains and the cover-up of those who know everything and say nothing? The mountains of West Virginia hold secrets that go back generations. Coal mining, logging, and now highway construction. All of it disturbs things that have been sleeping for a long time. The old-timers know this, but they also know that some knowledge is dangerous to share. I've done some research since then, carefully, quietly. There are records of similar disappearances going back decades, always associated with construction projects in remote areas. Workers who vanish without a trace, investigations that go nowhere. and companies that seemed to have protocols already in place for these situations. The confidentiality agreement I signed was specific in ways that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't just about not discussing the disappearance. It was about not discussing the location, the geological surveys, even the exact route of the proposed highway, as if the entire project was somehow connected to keeping certain areas undisturbed. I keep Adam's notebook in a safety deposit box now. Sometimes I think about turning it over to the authorities, but I know how that would go. A missing person case from years ago. No body. No evidence except the ravings of a construction supervisor who signed a paper saying he wouldn't talk about it. The mountains don't give up their secrets easily, and maybe that's how it should be. But I know now that when we carve our roads through the wilderness, we're not just moving earth and stone. We're disturbing things that have been waiting in the dark for a very long time. And sometimes they take what they need to keep their secrets safe. The cave is still there, somewhere in those hills. The highway project was never resumed, the route quietly abandoned for environmental concerns. But I know the real reason. Some places are meant to remain hidden, and some caves are meant to keep what they swallow. My name is Daniel, and throughout my life, I've always been the curious type, the one who can't let an opportunity to investigate the unknown pass by. Ever since I was a child, I found myself wondering why things were the way they were. Why did legends exist, myths, places that no one talked about? I grew up in a small town on the outskirts of Phoenix, in the Arizona desert. This place, with its scorching climate and absolute silence, seemed to be wrapped in a halo of mystery. Among all the stories that people shared, there was one that always caught my attention, the story of the Whispering Creek mine. It was said that the mine had been a prosperous gold extraction center in the early 1900s. However, after an unexpected collapse, the mine was abandoned, and since then, no one dared to approach it. Some spoke of the tragedies that occurred there, of the mysterious disappearances of workers, and of course, of the curses that weighed on the place. The stories I heard were so chilling that many preferred not to even mention the mine. Even so, as usually happens with the forbidden, my curiosity only grew. It was on a summer afternoon, when the sun was hitting the desert hardest, that I finally decided to put my impulse into practice. I had heard many times the old folks in town talk about the mine, and how dangerous it was to go there. Some said that voices could be heard coming from the depths of the earth. Others assured that they had seen strange shadows at the tunnel entrances. But as always happened to me, those stories seemed exaggerated. An attempt by the elders to keep us away from a place that seemed to call to me with force. My plan was simple: go alone, explore, and return before night fell. I knew the desert was unforgiving and that extreme temperatures could be deadly, but I had experience in the environment. I had lived my whole life surrounded by sand, cacti, and heat, and I didn't think an old, dusty tunnel could be so dangerous. When I reached the mine entrance, the feeling of solitude was immediate. The landscape was desolate, an endless horizon of arid land and rocks scattered everywhere. In the distance, I could see the ruined structure of what had once been a mine in full swing. The walls of the wooden buildings, now eaten away by time, were almost destroyed. The air smelled of dust and humidity, a strange mixture that made my hair stand on end. The mine entrance was partially blocked by debris, but with some effort, I managed to move some stones and access the interior. The atmosphere inside was cold, a contrast I couldn't understand given the warmth outside. The light from my flashlight barely managed to illuminate the hallways, but as soon as my eyes adapted, I could see that the tunnels extended in different directions, as if opening toward an underground labyrinth. I began to walk through one of the tunnels, feeling how the air became denser as I ventured deeper. The walls covered with moss and earth had deep cracks that let echoes of my footsteps escape. From time to time, I thought I heard a slight murmur, something so subtle that it made me wonder if it was the wind or if something was really there with me. I didn't want to think too much about it. I continued advancing, trying not to let uneasiness stop me. After a few minutes of exploration, I reached a fork in the road. One of the hallways deviated downward, and in the other, the ceiling seemed to be lower, which made walking difficult. I decided to take the descending path, guided by a strange intuition. The air became more humid, and slight moisture accumulated on the dirt floor. The walls of this tunnel seemed more worn, as if someone had been there recently. As I advanced, I found something that made me stop completely. An old wooden chair with a broken back, embedded in a rock wall. Around the chair, the floor was covered with a strange white powder, as if it had been scattered on purpose. The silence was absolute, but I couldn't stop feeling that someone else had been there. Without thinking much about it, I approached and examined the chair. That's when something shiny caught my attention. On the floor, next to the chair, there was a small gold chain, so old that it seemed to have been forgotten decades ago. The chain had a strangely shaped pendant, like a kind of rusted medallion. I picked it up, feeling a kind of heaviness when I did. I didn't know why, but something inside me told me that this small object was key to understanding what had happened in this place. I was so absorbed in the medallion that I didn't realize that behind me, the darkness seemed to have thickened even more. Suddenly, a dull noise resonated in the distance, as if something had fallen in one of the tunnels. I looked back, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow moving quickly between the walls. A chill ran through me, but I forced myself not to give in to panic. I was alone. It must have been a product of my mind. However, something inside me told me I wasn't as alone as I thought. I decided to return, but when I turned to go back through the tunnel I had come from, I noticed that the medallion in my hand was beginning to feel heavier. Somehow I felt attracted to the deeper hallways, as if an invisible force was pushing me toward them. I forced myself to leave it, but I couldn't help but look back toward the tunnel that seemed to lead to the depths of the mine. My breathing became heavier. Something wasn't right. The atmosphere in the tunnel was thick, and each step seemed to resonate strangely, as if the sound was amplified. Finally, without wanting to, I found a small vestibule where the air felt denser, charged with a strange weight. At the back, there was a half-broken wooden door, as if it had been closed hastily. I approached slowly. When I pushed it, the door opened with a creak, and I entered the room. The darkness was even deeper here, but the flashlight illuminated something that made me stop dead. On a wooden table, there were old black and white photographs, some of them so faded that I could barely distinguish them. I looked more carefully, and in one of them, I recognized something that made me realize the terrible truth. The men in the photograph weren't just mine workers. Some seemed to have the same gold chain I had found on the floor. The photos weren't just of common workers. They showed a group of men with a somber expression, some with visible wounds, others with a gleam in their eyes that I couldn't understand. At the bottom of the table, there was a yellowed letter with almost illegible text. I managed to decipher only one phrase. Betrayal runs through the veins of this place. At that moment, the sound of footsteps I had heard earlier returned. And this time, it wasn't just an echo. I looked toward the entrance, and what I saw made my heart stop. A thin and disproportionate figure appeared in the doorway. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me. I froze and felt pressure in my chest, as if the air had become denser. The figure said nothing, but its presence was oppressive. I began to back away, but each step I took made me feel more trapped. That's when I understood what had happened in that mine. The story of betrayals, of greed and suffering was imprinted in those dark hallways. The men in the photographs, those who had been condemned to work there, had been trapped in a cycle of death, their souls remaining trapped in the depths, waiting for someone else to fall into their same trap. I ran without thinking, traversing the tunnel at the speed my body allowed. Finally, I emerged into the sunlight, the medallion still in my hand. When I reached town, I felt relieved, but at the same time, I knew that something in me had changed. The Whispering Creek mine had not just been a workplace, but a cursed site where the echoes of betrayals and disappearances would never stop resonating. Even today, I can't stop thinking about what I saw and what I found. And although I've never approached the mine again, something tells me that the story hasn't ended, because there are places in the desert like that one that refuse to be forgotten. The medallion still sits in my dresser drawer, and sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear it calling to me, whispering secrets that I'm too afraid to understand. The townspeople still avoid talking about the mine, but I know that others will come, drawn by the same curiosity that led me there. The desert keeps its secrets well, but some secrets are too dark to remain buried forever. And in the depths of the Whispering Creek mine, something is still waiting, still watching, still remembering the betrayals that stained its tunnels with blood and sorrow. My name is Edward, and I'm a nature lover. I've always enjoyed escaping from the city, breathing fresh air, and disconnecting from the noise of daily life. A few weeks ago, a good friend of mine, Gabriel, and I decided to take an excursion to the forest in the northern area of Oregon, near Portland. It wasn't the first time we had camped there, but I had always loved the tranquility of this place, far from everything, surrounded only by trees and the crunch of earth under our boots. The plan was simple: spend 2 days camping, enjoy nature, and then return the next day. The forest is dense, but nothing out of the ordinary for those of us who have experience in this type of activity. We weren't afraid. On the contrary, we were excited about the idea of getting a little lost, walking without a fixed direction, and living the adventure. The first day was perfect. We set up the tent, lit a fire, and sat down to talk about old times. Laughter mixed with the sound of crickets and the wind moving the leaves. From time to time, some bird crossed the sky, but other than that, the place seemed peaceful, absolute tranquility. We prepared to spend the night and enjoy the warm atmosphere of the fire. But everything changed the next day. There was something strange in the air when we woke up. Gabriel and I woke up early at dawn to take a walk through the forest. The sun hadn't yet warmed completely, and the fresh air made our lungs feel alive. We decided to go further than we had traveled the day before, deeper into the forest. But something wasn't right. Although we didn't say it out loud, we both felt strange, as if the place were quieter than normal. In a forest like this, it's common to hear the animals, the sounds of nature that surround you. But that morning, it seemed like everything had gone silent. There wasn't a single sound, not a bird song, not the crackle of a branch being stepped on by some animal. Gabriel apparently noticed the same thing, because he began to look around with more attention than usual. After a while of walking, we decided to return to the campsite. But just when we were near the tent, Gabriel stopped dead. "Ed," he said with a worried look, "I think we're not okay." I looked at him confused. "What's wrong?" "I heard something," he replied, looking toward the interior of the forest, where the shadows seemed denser, like a noise, but I can't identify it. And the worst part is I don't know where it's coming from. I tried to downplay it, but I couldn't help feeling a small knot in my stomach. The feeling of discomfort increased as soon as we sat down again by the fire. Gabriel seemed more nervous than normal, and I didn't quite understand why. "Look, Ed, I have to go to town to get some food," Gabriel said suddenly, looking at the map he had taken from his backpack. "I can't stop thinking about what I heard. Maybe we need more provisions." At first it seemed strange to me, since we weren't that far from the tent. But then I understood it. Gabriel had always been somewhat anxious in situations like this, and maybe being so far from civilization was affecting him more than normal. "Okay, but don't leave me here alone," I said with a smile, trying to make the situation lighter. Gabriel assured me he would be back in a few hours, and although I was somewhat reluctant to stay alone, I didn't want to make a problem of it. I watched him venture into the forest with his backpack, and in a couple of minutes he disappeared among the trees. I, for my part, stayed at the campsite trying to enjoy the place, but something in my chest didn't feel right. Hours passed and the sun began to set. Meanwhile, I kept busy fixing the campsite and trying to calm myself. The daylight faded and night began to fall with its heavy blanket. It was when the air became colder and the sound of crickets and other nocturnal insects filled the silence of the forest. But even so, I felt something wasn't right. Something strange had settled in my mind. At 8 o'clock at night, Gabriel's phone stopped responding. At first I thought maybe he had lost signal, but as the minutes passed, fear began to invade me. I decided to leave the tent and go look for him, but darkness had fallen so hard that the forest seemed to swallow everything in its path. I called several times, but his phone kept not responding. I didn't want to panic, but anxiety began to consume me. I decided to walk in the direction he had disappeared, trusting I would find him near the path. But all I found was absolute emptiness. The darkness of the forest surrounded me, and I felt small before the enormity of the silence. Time passed, and darkness enveloped me completely. I didn't know if I had been walking for half an hour or for hours, but fatigue began to take hold of me. Besides, the fact that I couldn't hear even the slightest sound, not even the whisper of wind among the trees, made me even more nervous. At one point, fear began to take control. I felt my steps becoming heavy, as if something were watching me from the shadows. I looked around hoping to see something, but there were only the silhouettes of trees and the ground covered with leaves. Then I heard the first thing, a slight sound, almost imperceptible, coming from a nearby place. I thought it could be some animal, but I couldn't recognize the noise. It was like a creak, as if someone were stepping on a branch, but there was nothing in sight. My breathing became faster, and I began to walk faster, almost trotting in an attempt to get out of the thickness of the forest. But the sound continued. I wasn't alone. I felt someone or something was following me, maybe an animal or some person, but the sensation was so intense it was hard to think clearly. The anguish grew when I saw a shadow move quickly among the trees in the distance. My heart skipped a beat, and a chill ran down my back. I didn't know if it was Gabriel, or if what I was seeing was a product of my mind playing tricks. Then I decided to run, not because I thought I was close to him, but because fear had paralyzed me. I ran and ran, stumbling over roots and branches, not really knowing where I was going. I just wanted to escape that oppressive feeling that was chasing me. But the forest seemed bigger than I remembered. Fear had blinded me. When I finally stopped, exhausted and breathless, I found myself in a clearing. The moonlight allowed me to see a little more, but what I saw froze me. There were fresh tracks on the ground, large tracks, as if someone had passed through there recently. I looked toward the trees, but I saw nothing. Suddenly, a voice called me from behind the trees, and the echo of its sound made me jump. It was Gabriel's voice, but something in it sounded strange. His tone wasn't the same. It didn't have the urgency I had heard before. "Ed, where are you?" he said. But the voice was distorted, as if it came from a distant place, but at the same time close. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped in my own mind, and fear was beginning to take hold of every thought. The voice kept calling me, but I could never find it. Finally, when I couldn't stand it anymore, I returned running to the campsite with my heart at 1,000 beats per hour. It no longer made sense to keep looking. The next day, Gabriel never returned. They found his backpack near the edge of the river, but no trace of him. I could never forget that whisper in the darkness, nor the tracks that led me to get lost in the forest. And since then, every time I walk through a place as solitary as that, I feel something is following me, something that doesn't belong to this world. The dawn arrived, but it didn't bring comfort. Hours passed, then a complete day, and there were still no signs of Gabriel. Desperation had reached me, but for some reason, I didn't want to believe what I was already beginning to suspect. That something had occurred in that forest, something out of the ordinary that had altered our perception of reality. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice that had called me the night before. Although I recognized it as Gabriel's, something in the way it sounded disturbed me. It wasn't just that it was distorted, but there was an echo in it, as if the words came from a very distant place. As the hours passed, I found myself unable to stay still. The camping tent we had set up so carefully was now a shelter that offered me no peace. I decided to go to town. My mind kept spinning. What if Gabriel had found help? What if something serious had happened and he needed me to find him as quickly as possible? I left everything as it was, took my backpack with the basics, and ventured into the forest again. The trip to town shouldn't have taken more than 3 hours. And although the sun was already higher, the cold morning air kept me alert. Every crack of a branch under my feet made me turn around, feeling as if the trees were watching me. As I advanced, I couldn't help but constantly look around, searching for some sign of Gabriel or something that would indicate that everything was okay. But as had happened the day before, the forest seemed completely empty. Even the insects, which are normally felt lurking during the day, had gone silent. The environment was so quiet that I felt even my own steps were too much noise. The sun reached its zenith when I finally saw a sign, a small clearing where I found an old, completely abandoned wooden cabin. I didn't remember having seen it before, and although my first instinct was to continue forward, something in the structure made me approach. The door was ajar, and as I got closer, I felt a slight vibration in the air, something that wasn't quite normal, as if the atmosphere were charged. I decided to enter. Maybe I would find something there that would help me understand what was happening, or maybe Gabriel had passed through there. The cabin was dark and dusty, but in the back, in a corner, I saw something that made me stop. There was a small wooden table covered with a torn and old cloth. On it was a map. It wasn't a common map. This one seemed to be of the area, but with strange roots and marks that I didn't recognize. My mind tried to understand it, but something didn't fit. The map seemed ancient. Suddenly, I heard something behind me, a slight creak followed by a whisper. I turned quickly, my breathing agitated, but there was no one, only the sound of wind moving the branches outside the cabin. Panic began to take hold of me again. But this time something told me I should get out of there as quickly as possible. I closed the cabin door forcefully and launched myself toward the path that would take me to town. My pace was accelerated, almost a run, but as I advanced, I began to hear something. A low whisper, almost imperceptible, that didn't come from around me, but from inside my head. I felt as if someone were breathing in my ear, whispering words I couldn't understand. I accelerated my pace even more. At that moment, my phone vibrated. I looked at the screen, and to my surprise, I saw a message. It was from Gabriel. I opened it quickly, hoping he had managed to get out of the forest or at least find something that would give me hope. But what I read left me frozen. "Don't follow me, it's not what it seems." My hands trembled as I read those words. What did he mean by that? Why was he sending me that message now when he couldn't be near? The question remained floating in my mind, but I didn't have time to think about it too much. As soon as I looked around, I realized I was no longer on the same trail. The forest had disoriented me. All I could see now was the same tangle of trees. The darkness of the afternoon had filtered completely, and the cold was becoming more and more intense. The fear, which had been cornered in the depths of my being, began to emerge from its hiding place. At that moment, I saw a figure in the distance. At first, I thought it was a play of lights or my mind playing a trick on me. But when I looked more closely, I realized it wasn't a tree or a shadow. It was someone standing at the edge of the trail. I approached cautiously, and when I was close enough to see clearly, I froze. It was Gabriel, but it wasn't the Gabriel I knew. He didn't look like him. His face was pale. His eyes shone with a strange, almost inhuman intensity. His clothes were torn as if he had been wandering for days, and his posture was rigid, as if he couldn't move naturally. "Gabriel," I said, barely able to believe what I was seeing. My voice trembled. He didn't respond. He just stared at me fixedly, without a change in his expression, without the slightest reaction. "Gabriel, are you okay?" I asked a little louder, trying to get him to respond, but his gaze didn't change. Then, as if he were taking air for the first time in hours, his lips opened, and he released a phrase that froze my blood. "Don't go further, Ed. They're waiting." And with those words, the figure began to fade. It didn't leave walking or running. It disintegrated as if it were just a shadow, a mist that vanished at contact with the wind. I stood there paralyzed, feeling the night swallow me completely. I didn't know if what I had seen was real or a product of my mind overwhelmed by fear, but something told me I should escape. However, the sound that emerged from the darkness made me realize I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone in the forest. A slight sound like a whisper, but stronger this time, began to fill the air. It didn't come from any particular direction, but from everywhere. And I realized something terrifying. I wasn't alone. It wasn't just Gabriel or a lost figure in the forest. Someone or something was waiting for me, and I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. Without thinking, I took a path to the right, moving away from the main trail. Fear pushed me, and my legs couldn't take it anymore. I ran without direction. I simply wanted to get out of that place. But for some reason, I felt I was getting closer to something. Something dark. Something that had been lurking in the forest all along. And then I knew it. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a prison. And I had just fallen into its trap. I kept running, but the echo of the forest never left me in peace. My name is Sebastian, and I need to share this story with you because it's been eating at me for years. It's about why buying secondhand sometimes brings more than just a good deal. It brings the ghosts of the past along with it. At 25, I was working 2 jobs just to make ends meet in San Antonio, Texas. I'd been taking the bus everywhere, which meant long commutes and being at the mercy of the city's transit schedule. Having my own car felt like an impossible dream, something that would have to wait until I could save up enough for a decent down payment. That's when I saw the Facebook Marketplace listing that changed everything. A 2005 black Volkswagen Jetta priced at $8,000. The photos showed a car that was clearly used but well maintained, with black leather seats and a sunroof that had always been on my wish list. The seller, a guy named Carlos, messaged me back within an hour. He said he needed to sell quickly because he was moving to California for work and couldn't take the car with him. The price was firm, but he was willing to meet me that same evening if I was serious. I scraped together every dollar I had, borrowed some money from my brother, and met Carlos at a gas station on the south side of town. The car looked even better in person than it had in the photos. The paint was glossy black without any major scratches. The interior was clean, and when Carlos started the engine, it purred like a well-tuned machine. "I've taken good care of her," Carlos said, running his hand along the hood with what looked like genuine affection. "Regular oil changes, new tires last year, and I just had the AC serviced. She's been a reliable car." I took it for a test drive around the block, and everything felt perfect. The steering was responsive, the brakes were solid, and the transmission shifted smoothly. When I handed over the cash and Carlos signed the title, I felt like I'd won the lottery. The first thing I noticed when I got in alone was the smell. It was subtle but distinct, a sweet floral scent like jasmine and vanilla, mixed with something that reminded me of children's shampoo. I assumed Carlos had used some kind of air freshener, or that maybe his girlfriend had left some perfume in the car. The scent wasn't unpleasant, just noticeable. If anything, it made the car feel more welcoming, like someone had cared about making it a comfortable space. For the first week, I was in heaven. Having my own transportation meant I could take extra shifts at work, visit friends without planning around bus schedules, and finally feel like an independent adult. My family was proud of me, and I offered rides to anyone who needed them. But strange things started happening during my second week of ownership. I was driving home from my evening job, taking a quiet residential street to avoid traffic, when I glanced in the rearview mirror to check for other cars. Instead of seeing the empty street behind me, I saw a small face looking back at me. It was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair that looked damp and clung to her face. She was sitting in the back seat, directly behind me, and for just a moment, our eyes met in the mirror. I jerked the steering wheel in surprise, nearly hitting a parked car, and immediately pulled over. My heart was pounding as I turned around to look at the back seat, but there was nothing there. Just empty black leather and the faint scent of jasmine. I sat there for several minutes, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. I'd been working long hours, I was tired, and the streetlights could have created shadows that my brain interpreted as a face. It had to be something like that. But it wasn't the last time I saw her. The second appearance happened about a week later, on a rainy Thursday evening. I was stuck in traffic on Interstate 35, and the rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers was almost hypnotic. I was tired and a little frustrated by the slow-moving traffic when I heard it. A soft sound from the back seat, like someone shifting position or getting comfortable. It was subtle, but distinct enough that I immediately looked in the rearview mirror. The little girl was there again, but this time she was lying down across the back seat, as if she were taking a nap. Her hair was spread across the leather, and she had one small hand tucked under her cheek. She looked peaceful, almost content. I was so startled that I nearly rear-ended the car in front of me. When I looked back again, she was gone. Traffic cleared up after that, and I drove home in a state of confused anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the car, that someone was watching me from the back seat, even when I couldn't see them. That weekend, I was hanging out with some friends at a local sports bar, and I mentioned the car in passing. Nothing about the strange sightings, just that I'd finally gotten my own transportation and was loving the freedom it gave me. My friend Marcus walked out with me when I was leaving, and as we approached the Jetta, he suddenly stopped. "Dude, you didn't tell me you had a kid," he said, peering into the back seat. "What are you talking about?" I asked, unlocking the car. "There's a little girl in your back seat. She's pressed up against the window like she's looking out." I followed his gaze, and sure enough, there was a small silhouette visible through the tinted rear window. It looked like a child sitting in the back seat, leaning against the glass. "That's impossible," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "The car's been locked and I was just in the bar." Marcus walked closer to the window, shading his eyes with his hand to get a better look. "She's got dark hair, and she's wearing what looks like a school uniform. Blue and white, I think. Man, she's just sitting there so quietly. Is she okay?" I unlocked the car and opened the rear door, my hands shaking. The back seat was empty, but the leather was slightly warm, as if someone had been sitting there. "There's no one here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked at me with confusion and concern, but I saw her clear as day. She was right there, looking out the window. How did she disappear? I didn't have an answer for him. I made up some excuse about the tinted windows creating optical illusions, but I could tell Marcus wasn't convinced. Hell, I wasn't convinced either. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the little girl, about how real she'd looked, about the way Marcus had seen her too. This wasn't just my imagination or fatigue-induced hallucinations. Other people were seeing her. Things escalated over the next few weeks. I'd hear the soft sound of a child's voice humming in the back seat, always just quiet enough that I couldn't make out the melody. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of small hands pressed against the rear window, leaving no fingerprints, but somehow making their presence known. The most unsettling incident happened when I was visiting my mother. I'd parked in front of her house and was walking up the driveway when she called out from her front porch. "Sebastian Mijo, who's that little girl in your car?" I turned around, and there she was, visible through the rear window, sitting upright in the back seat like she was waiting for me to return. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mom," I said, but my voice was shaking. "She's been sitting there the whole time you've been inside. Dark hair, pretty little dress. She looks so sad, honey. Why don't you bring her inside? I'll make her some cookies." I walked back to the car, my mother following behind me. When I opened the rear door, the back seat was empty, but the jasmine scent was stronger than ever. "Where did she go?" my mother asked, genuinely confused. "She was right there. I saw her as clear as I'm seeing you now." That's when I knew I had to find out the truth about the car's history. I contacted Carlos, the man who'd sold it to me, and asked if we could meet for coffee. I told him I had some questions about the car's maintenance history, but really, I needed to know what had happened to create this haunting. Carlos was reluctant to meet at first, but eventually agreed. We sat in a Starbucks near his old neighborhood, and I could tell he was uncomfortable from the moment he sat down. "The car's been good to you, right?" he asked, stirring his coffee nervously. "No mechanical problems." "The car runs great," I said, "but I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Has anyone ever died in that car?" Carlos's face went pale, and he set down his coffee cup with a trembling hand. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I keep seeing a little girl in the back seat. Other people have seen her too. She's not threatening or scary, just there. And I get the feeling she's connected to the car somehow." Carlos was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that were filled with pain. "Her name was Sophia," he said quietly. "She was my daughter, 8 years old, in 2nd grade at Sacred Heart Elementary. She was the sweetest little girl you could imagine, always humming songs and asking a million questions about everything." I felt my stomach drop. What happened to her? It was about a year ago. I was picking her up from school, and we were stopped at a red light on Flora Street. Some drunk driver in a pickup truck ran the light going about 50 miles per hour. He hit us on the passenger side, right where Sophia was sitting. Carlos's voice broke, and he had to pause to compose himself. "She died instantly. The doctors said she didn't suffer, but," he shook his head, "I couldn't drive the car after that. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see her sitting there in her school uniform, asking me about homework or telling me about her day." "That's why you sold it," I said, understanding flooding through me. "I tried to get rid of it right after the accident, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It was like selling away the last piece of her, but keeping it was torture. Every day I'd see that empty back seat and remember how she used to sit there, always on the passenger side, always with her seatbelt on like I taught her. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing the weight of what he'd told me. "I should have told you," Carlos said finally. "But I was afraid you wouldn't buy it, and I really needed the money to move. I thought maybe if the car went to someone who didn't know what happened, Sophia's spirit might finally rest." "She's not resting," I said gently. "She's still there, still riding in the back seat. My mother saw her and wanted to invite her in for cookies." Carlos smiled sadly. She loved cookies. Chocolate chip were her favorite. I made the difficult decision to sell the car that same week. I didn't want to profit from Sophia's tragedy, so I sold it for less than I'd paid, just wanting it out of my life. The family who bought it was young, with no children of their own, and I didn't tell them about Sophia. I figured they'd either never see her, or they'd figure it out on their own. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if she's still there, still riding in the back seat, still waiting for her father to take her home from school. I wonder if she's found peace, or if she's still looking out the rear window, humming softly to herself, while she waits for a journey that will never end. The experience taught me that some things carry more than just their physical history. They carry the love, the pain, the memories of everyone who's ever owned them. And sometimes, those feelings are so strong that they leave an imprint that can never be washed away, no matter how many times the car changes hands. If you ever buy a used car and notice a sweet floral scent that won't go away, or if you catch glimpses of movement in your rearview mirror, maybe take a moment to remember that you're not just buying a vehicle. You're inheriting someone's story, someone's memories, and sometimes someone's love that was too strong to let go. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.